Hey guys, tonight we're diving headfirst into a chapter of history that's equal parts jaw-dropping and eyebrow-raising. We're talking about medieval kings, the crowned rulers who strutted around in silks and jewels, commanded armies that could flatten villages, and yet somehow managed to spend half their waking hours chasing the next scandalous pleasure. You probably won't survive this journey if you were actually dropped into their world. Between the plagues, the lack of plumbing and the general medieval hygiene situation, you'd be toast in a week. But since you're safe at home in the 21st century, sipping whatever cosy drink you've got, you get the best seat in the house to peek behind the velvet curtains of royal bedrooms. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I don't want pity likes. I want honest, yes, I enjoy hearing about a king who hoarded mistresses like trading cards likes. And while you're at it, drop a quick comment. Tell me your city and the time you're listening. It's always fascinating to know if someone in Manila is hearing this while they're commuting in traffic, or someone in Toronto is already curled under blankets fighting off sleep. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The medieval world wasn't exactly shy about mixing power with pleasure. Think of a royal court as a giant, messy cocktail party that never ended. Banners draped across cold stone halls, the smell of roasted meat sticking to your clothes, musicians fiddling until their fingers bled, and everyone buzzing with gossip. Some of the gossip was harmless, who got drunk and fell into the moat, but some whispered tales were dark enough to make monks clutch their rosaries. And kings, they weren't just the centre of government, they were the beating heart of these scandals. When the king's desires became unconventional, let's say, the entire realm had to live with it. Take this as a reality check. Medieval rulers weren't subject to the same rules you and I are. If a king woke up one morning and decided he needed a new mistress, he didn't have to make a profile on a dating app. He had messengers, armies and priests willing to cover for him. When you hold divine authority, your fantasies, however bizarre, can spill across the kingdom. But here's the strange thing. Chroniclers, monks and poets often wrote about these kings in a way that blurred the line between fact and gossip. Were they really that perverted? Or were enemies exaggerating? That's the fun part. Historians are still arguing over where the truth ends and the bedtime rumour mill begins. Picture yourself stepping into a banquet hall in the 10th century. The long oak tables groan with trenchers of bread, greasy roast pork, flagons of ale. Servants scurry between benches while minstrels strum out something vaguely cheerful. And there, on the high seat under the canopy, is the king. His crown gleaming, his eyes roving over the crowd not for loyal knights or potential advisors, but for whichever poor soul will end up in his chambers tonight. The court knows it, the bishops know it, the guards know it, and somehow everybody pretends this is fine. Here's a fun, quirky fact to set the stage. Medieval people genuinely believed that rulers' private vices could infect their kingdoms like a disease. If a king was greedy, the harvest might fail. If he was lustful, storms might batter the coast. Imagine living in a world where your crops withered not because of weather, but because your monarch couldn't keep it in his hose. Farmers out in the fields would grumble, "Well, there goes the wheat. We all know the king's been sneaking off with half the ladies of the court again." And honestly, who's to say they didn't have a point? But before you laugh too hard, consider the scholarly debate that runs quietly beneath all this. Were medieval kings actually more debauched than the average person? Or were they just unlucky enough to have every move recorded? After all, plenty of commoners probably indulged in their own peculiar fantasies, but no wandering bard was scribbling it into history. Power magnified every secret. So the question becomes, were these kings genuinely the most perverted, or simply the most publicised? Historians wrestle with this one because sources were often written by enemies eager to smear reputations. A chronicler who hated the king might casually mention that he preferred goat-themed bedroom games, and voila, centuries later, we're here gossiping about it. As we drift forward tonight, we'll meet kings who held wild feasts filled with male lovers dressed as angels, emperors who staged bizarre bedroom experiments in the name of science, and rulers whose mistresses became so numerous that entire towns whispered about their names. Each tale will be delivered like a slow unravelling of a cloak, sometimes dark, sometimes hilarious, but always dripping with that strange medieval mix of politics and perversion. For now, though, just breathe in the candlelit air of that first great hall. The torches crackle, the gossip hums louder than the lute strings. Somewhere, a servant is already spreading the latest rumour that the king invited his falconer's apprentice to his bed. You're about to follow the footsteps of power and passion where they meet in the strangest corners of history, and the first king we'll sneak up on is Charles the Bald, a man whose very name suggests shiny vulnerability, but whose private appetites made the church wince. You shuffle closer in the candlelit corridors of Frankish Europe, and the first crown we peek behind belongs to Charles the Bald. Now right away you might think, bald? What kind of nickname is that? It's actually misleading. Charles probably wasn't bald at all. Medieval chroniclers loved a good insult, and slapping him with the bald was their way of poking fun at a ruler who, truth be told, had more to hide in his private chambers than on his scalp. This was the grandson of Charlemagne himself, ruling the western half of the empire in the 9th century, a time when the church's shadow stretched across every bedroom and every banquet. If you were king, you were supposed to be the shining model of Christian morality. Spoiler alert, Charles wasn't exactly shining. So what made Charles stand out in the scandal department? According to whispers that slid through monasteries and courts, he had a particular obsession with surrounding himself with women, even to the point of bringing them into religious spaces where they definitely weren't welcome. Imagine the holiest abbeys in town, cloaked in incense and chants, suddenly echoing with the laughter of royal mistresses sneaking through corridors. Priests would frown and monks would scribble furious complaints. And Charles? He just kept on parading his companions in and out. There's even a chronicled accusation that he had affairs not just with noble women, but with women tied to the church, scandalous enough to make bishops choke on their communion wine. Here's where the quirky detail comes in. Charles was so obsessed with physical intimacy that it became wrapped up in his public image. Some sources claimed he performed almost ritual-like acts with his lovers, as if combining his royal authority with his bedroom antics. Was that exaggeration? Almost certainly. But medieval chroniclers loved turning a king's private life into allegory. If Charles was weak in morality, maybe he'd be weak in defending the kingdom. So rumours weren't just gossip, they were political weapons sharpened to a point. One particular story hovers around his court, that Charles, despite his many dalliances, had a strange insecurity about ageing and potency. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a king buying a sports car. Instead of flashy objects, Charles tried to project vigour through the number of partners he displayed at court. He paraded mistresses like trophies at tournaments, as if their presence alone would prove he was still virile enough to rule. Whether it was true or not, the very idea that monks were writing about this shows just how much sex and politics were braided together in his reign. Now here's where the debate kicks in. Was Charles truly the medieval Hugh Hefner, or were these stories twisted propaganda? Historians argue over this all the time. Many of the accounts we have come from clerical writers who despised rulers for interfering with church lands. Charles often clashed with bishops about property rights, taxes and authority. So what's the easiest way to smear a king in a hyper-religious society? Call him lustful. Suggest he can't keep his robes tied. Insinuate that he's sneaking mistresses into sacred abbeys. That sort of accusation stuck like tar, because it painted him not only as a sinner, but as a hypocrite, the worst crime in the eyes of his contemporaries. Picture yourself standing at one of his court feasts. The hall is buzzing with voices, the air thick with smoke from dripping torches, platters of venison glistening under greasy candles. You'd expect the king to focus on alliances, laws, or the Viking raiders battering his coasts, but instead all eyes are on Charles whispering with a young woman draped in pearls, sliding his hand across hers in plain view of bishops seated nearby. The entire feast turns into a silent theatre. Courtiers raise their brows, clergy cross themselves, and the king smirks as though daring anyone to challenge him. The oddest little tidbit about Charles is that he may have been fascinated by mixing the sacred and the sensual. Some reports claim he enjoyed staging grand processions that blurred the line between ritual and indulgence, dressing his favourites in lavish robes usually reserved for church ceremonies. Imagine a mistress strutting down the nave of a cathedral wearing silk embroidered with crosses, while scandalised monks nearly faint in the choir stalls. Did this actually happen, or was it just propaganda gone wild? Hard to know, but it shows you the intensity of imagination when it came to vilifying kings with a taste for extravagance. If you pause for a moment, you realise how fragile his reputation really was. In the medieval world, the line between ruler and sinner was perilously thin. To be king meant being elevated as God's chosen, yet at the same time, you were watched more closely than anyone else. Every slip, every glance, every late-night knock on a chamber door could turn into a sermon against you. And Charles, whether guilty or not, became a symbol of indulgence at odds with holiness. The scholarly debate today is fascinating. Some historians defend him, suggesting that most of these stories were exaggerated because he was simply unpopular with certain clerics. Others argue that where there's smoke, there's fire. Too many reports mention his obsessions for it to be entirely fabricated. The truth may be in the middle, a ruler who liked pleasure more than he should have, but who became larger than life through the lens of angry monks. Either way, his name ended up forever tied not to victories or policies, but to whispers of lust. So as you leave Charles's smoky feast hall, with the echoes of laughter and a gossip bouncing off the stone walls, keep this in mind. Power gave medieval kings the freedom to act out their desires, but it also made those desires impossible to hide. The next ruler we'll visit takes that lesson and turns it into a carnival of flamboyance and danger. William Rufus, the Red King of England, didn't just indulge. He turned his court into something like the medieval version of Las Vegas, complete with scandalous companions and rumours that made bishops sweat through their robes. You slip across the channel now away from Charles's abbey-gate scandals and into England's smoky, rain-drenched courts. Waiting there is William II of England, better known as William Rufus, or the Red King. That nickname, it could have come from his ruddy complexion, or from his fiery temper, or, if you listen to gossip, from his equally fiery appetite for things not usually discussed in polite company. He reigned from 1087 to 1100, a relatively short span, but long enough to stir up more than his share of whispers about what went on when the torches burned low in the halls of Westminster. William Rufus was the son of William the Conqueror, which already made him a hard act to follow. His father had just stormed England, reshaped its nobility, and terrified everyone into obedience. William Rufus, he preferred a different kind of conquest. Chroniclers describe his court as flamboyant to the point of scandal, packed with brightly dressed young men, dripping with jewels and perfume, and always ready to indulge in a feast that slid from drunken revelry into, well, activities that the church spent years condemning. One monk sniffed that Rufus kept his hall full of effeminate men who wasted their days in idleness and nights in sin, which is medieval monk speak for the king was throwing the kind of parties where bishops would rather not even peek through the door. Imagine entering one of those feasts. The firelight flickers across tapestries, goblets of wine splash over wooden tables, and somewhere in the chaos, men are dancing, yes, dancing in flamboyant robes that scandalise everyone used to grim Norman austerity. To us, it might sound like theatre. To the 11th century church, it was downright perverted, and Rufus, instead of toning it down, seemed to revel in the outrage. It's as if he delighted in poking the bishop's nerves, flaunting his chosen companions as though daring the church to strike him down. Here's a quirky little detail. Rufus allegedly loved wearing shoes that glittered with strange, almost effeminate designs, a choice that seems trivial until you remember how symbolic clothing was. In an age when boots were supposed to be rugged and practical, his ornate footwear became a lightning rod for accusations of decadence. Chroniclers practically screamed, "Look at this man's shoes! If his feet are this corrupt, imagine what the rest of him is doing." It sounds ridiculous, but in the medieval world symbolism mattered more than substance. Your shoes could damn your soul, but the deeper question is, was William Rufus truly indulging in what we'd now label as homoerotic relationships, or was this just an elaborate smear campaign? Some historians lean toward the idea that he lived openly with male favourites, most notably a circle of handsome courtiers who were given extraordinary privileges. Others argue that the evidence is thin, and that moralistic chroniclers simply exaggerated his court's excesses to paint him as godless. After all, William was famously hostile to the church. He delayed appointing bishops, squeezed the clergy for money, and generally treated church authority with mocking disdain. If you're a monk furious with your king, hinting that he's corrupting men in his private chambers is a powerful weapon. That being said, the sheer consistency of the descriptions makes you pause. Over and over, chroniclers complain about the immorality of his court, the unnatural vices, the effeminacy of his companions. Even if some of this was propaganda, it seems William Rufus was at least guilty of living flamboyantly enough to fuel the gossip fire. He didn't hide, he strutted. And for a medieval king, strutting with jewelled youths at your side was about as bold a declaration as you could make. Now picture the tension in that world. On one hand, Rufus's companions adored him, basking in the luxury and privilege of his favour. On the other, the church simmered, seeing his behaviour as a direct insult to Christian morality. Medieval England was supposed to be the model of piety, freshly conquered and reordered under God's banner. Instead, they got a king who turned the royal court into a theatre of indulgence. One chronicler moaned that under Rufus, the whole kingdom swarmed with shameful acts. That's not subtle. The strangest part? William Rufus seemed untouchable, until of course he wasn't. In 1100 he died suddenly during a hunting trip in the New Forest, struck by an arrow in what's still debated as either an accident or an assassination. His flamboyant lifestyle, his disdain for the church, his love for scandalous companions, all of it built up enemies. Was his death payback for his perversions? Or was it just bad luck in a forest thick with arrows? Historians still argue, some whispering conspiracies about his brother Henry arranging the accident, others pointing out that hunting was always risky. Still, the poetic irony is hard to miss. The Red King brought down not in a bedroom or banquet, but in the wilderness, as though nature itself snapped back at his excess. The debate lingers like smoke after a fire. Was William Rufus truly one of the most perverted kings of the medieval world, or just a flamboyant monarch whose enemies couldn't stomach his defiance of tradition? The answer, as always, probably lies in the messy middle. Maybe he loved his jewelled shoes, his handsome companions, his lavish banquets, and maybe the monks amplified those quirks into a full-blown portrait of sin. But either way, his court has gone down as one of the most scandalous in English memory. So as you leave Rufus's glittering hall, the echoes of drunken laughter still rattling in your ears, you can feel the church's disapproval trailing close behind. The next king we'll meet shows just how dangerous these shadow games could become. Philip IV of France, the man who played puppet master with his enemies, while rumours of his own secret liaisons tangled him in webs he could never quite cut free. The air grows heavier now as you drift from Rufus's jewelled chaos into the cold, calculating chambers of Philip IV of France. Known as Philip the Fair because of his striking looks, tall, pale, and almost unnervingly handsome, he reigned from 1285 to 1314, ruling with the kind of precision that made enemies call him less a man and more a marble statue. But behind that chiselled exterior the rumour mill churned. The king who crushed the Knights Templar, who taxed the church until popes quaked, was whispered to have his own shadow games going on in the bedchamber. And unlike William Rufus, who flaunted everything, Philip moved like a spider, silent, deliberate, and maybe just as venomous. At first glance, you'd think Philip was the model of medieval piety. He carried himself with icy dignity, never joking, rarely smiling, his court arranged with rigid ceremony. Chroniclers say he radiated authority and silence. But that silence created space for gossip to fester, and gossip did not disappoint. One of the juiciest scandals came from his own household. His 3 daughters-in-law were accused of carrying on affairs with dashing young knights, supposedly sneaking their lovers into the royal palace with the help of purses embroidered by hand. It was called the Tour de Nesle Affair, and while it centred on the women, the scandal's shadow stretched over Philip II. How could a king so fair allow his house to rot with perversion? Did he turn a blind eye because he had his own secrets to hide? Quirky little detail time. Some reports say Philip was fascinated by astrology and the darker arts, keeping magicians and fortune-tellers close. Imagine a king so coldly logical by day, but secretly whispering questions about his future to star readers by night. Now, medieval superstition already linked astrology with illicit desires. To some, this was evidence enough. If he was dabbling in stars, he was dabbling in sins. Even the Templars, when put on trial by Philip, were accused of sexual perversion and idol worship. Was he projecting his own anxieties onto them? Scholars argue about that, but the timing is suspicious. Here's where it gets thorny. Was Philip personally indulging in perversions, or was he simply the victim of a culture that weaponized sexuality as propaganda? Some argue he was obsessively pious and almost puritanical, too cold to be scandalous. Others suggest his rigidity was a mask, that beneath it he may have harboured darker tastes he kept hidden. The Tour de Nesle Affair gave enemies free rein to paint the whole Capetian dynasty as decadent. The fact that 2 of his daughters-in-law were imprisoned for years, their lovers tortured to death, only added to the whispers that Philip's household was a nest of corruption. Did he punish them out of moral outrage, or as a political cover for his own secrets? Historians are still divided, picture the palace on a winter night. Torches coke in the draughty halls, tapestries ripple with candlelight, and somewhere in the upper chambers, muffled voices drift through thick stone walls. Knights in polished armour slip into chambers where royal daughters wait, their laughter hushed, their secrets sewn into silken sleeves. Servants whisper in the kitchens, monks mutter at prayers, and the king sits in the great hall below, expressionless, unblinking, as though carved from marble. But the silence speaks volumes. Everyone suspects something, but no one dares say it aloud, because Philip has a habit of crushing anyone who opposes him. Another odd thread in the tapestry. Philip's reputation for fairness in appearance may have fueled some of the rumours. Medieval chroniclers sometimes linked physical beauty to moral corruption, a kind of too perfect to be pure logic, so when the king's court turned scandalous, it was easy to imagine that his flawless exterior concealed unspeakable sins. The irony is that the one clear historical fact about Philip is his almost obsessive drive to control and punish immorality, at least when it suited his political goals. But was that obsession born out of hypocrisy? That's the debate. And here's a scholarly bombshell. Some researchers believe the Tour de Nesle Affair wasn't about lust at all, but about succession politics. If Philip's sons' wives were unfaithful, it cast doubt on the legitimacy of heirs. That gave Philip leverage to manipulate inheritance and power. In that sense, the scandal may have been engineered, either by him or his circle, not because the affairs were real, but because they were useful. Which makes you wonder, was Philip perverted in private or just perverted in his use of sex scandals as political tools? Maybe the real kink was power itself. Still, the whispers lingered. After Philip's death, the Capetian dynasty seemed cursed, his sons died young, his heirs stumbled, and the French crown plunged into crisis. Chroniclers later called it the Curse of the Templars, a divine punishment for Philip's cruelty and corruption. Whether that curse sprang from his supposed perversions, or simply from the political fallout of his reign, it sealed his reputation as a king who looked holy on the outside but was rotting within. So you step out of Philip's palace, the cold Parisian air hitting your face, and you realise the pattern beginning to form. Some kings flaunted their desires, some hid them behind masks of marble, but all of them left trails of rumour thick enough to choke the pages of history. The next ruler you'll meet, Frederick II of the Holy Roman Empire, didn't just indulge in desire, he mixed it with science, experimentation and curiosity in ways that still make historians scratch their heads. If you thought astrology was odd, wait until you hear about the emperor who treated his bedroom like a laboratory. Step into the sun-scorched lands of Sicily now, where Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, ruled like no other. If William Rufus was flamboyant and Philip IV was cold marble, Frederick was a dazzling contradiction. Equal parts philosopher, warlord, satirist, giantist, and according to rumours, a man whose curiosity in the bedroom rivaled his curiosity in the laboratory. He reigned in the early 13th century, earning the nickname Stupa Mundi, the wonder of the world. But behind the marble statues and Latin titles, the gossip about Frederick made even hardened chroniclers blush. Frederick had this habit of treating people, sometimes even lovers, as experiments. He was obsessed with knowledge, languages, medicine, astrology, falconry, philosophy. And yet, in true medieval rumour mill fashion, that thirst for discovery allegedly bled over into his sensual life. There are stories that he used mistresses and concubines not only for pleasure but for tests, trying to measure everything from fertility to endurance. Did he actually do this? Hard to prove, but the image stuck. A king who turned his private chamber into a laboratory. Imagine a candlelit room filled not just with silks and perfumes, but with scrolls, measuring devices, and a scribe nervously taking notes while the emperor explored his curiosities. Here's a quirky fact that feels almost too on-brand. Frederick once supposedly tried to test whether infants had a natural language by raising them in total silence. It ended horribly, but it shows you the lengths he'd go to satisfy his curiosity. Now, imagine applying that same experimental impulse to his romantic life. Chroniclers accused him of treating lovers like data points. Some even claimed he kept exotic concubines from across the Mediterranean, chosen not only for beauty, but for how they might reveal the mysteries of nature. It sounds bizarre, but in the medieval imagination, Frederick was a man with no boundaries between science and sin. The church loathed him for it. popes thundered that Frederick was the Antichrist in waiting, a man too worldly, too lustful, too arrogant. And in the papal smear campaigns, his supposed perversions became ammunition. They said he filled his Sicilian palace with harems like some Eastern despot, that he indulged in Saracen vices, picked up during his alliances with Muslim rulers, that his court was more brothel than throne. Whether true or exaggerated, the whispers painted him as a ruler who had no shame in testing the limits of both morality and the human body. Picture yourself in Palermo, inside Frederick's court. It's not a dark northern hall, it's a palace of mosaics and marble, fountains bubbling into the courtyards, Arabic poets reciting verses alongside Latin philosophers. But behind closed doors the mood shifts. The emperor enters with a hawk on his wrist. He adored falconry, and dismisses his advisors with a gesture. A group of concubines draped in silks of every colour wait like pieces in some grand human chessboard, and instead of simply indulging, Frederick is rumoured to question them, to probe, to treat every moment as a way to unlock the secrets of creation. Here's where the scholarly debate heats up. Was Frederick really conducting sexual experiments, or was this a projection of his enemies' fears? Some historians think the accusations were exaggerated by church chroniclers who despised his openness to Islamic culture. To a medieval monk, his fondness for Arab medicine and philosophy already looked like heresy. Mix in tales of concubines from the East, and suddenly he became the poster child for corruption. Others argue that the smoke might mean fire, that Frederick's insatiable thirst for knowledge really did lead him into strange intimate experiments. After all, this is the same man who dissected animals in search of hidden truths, and who invited scholars to test ideas that others considered blasphemy. Why not take that same approach into the private sphere? Another fascinating angle. Frederick wrote a famous treatise on falconry filled with meticulous observations of birds' mating habits. He studied how they paired, how they bred, how their instincts guided them. Is it such a stretch to imagine he applied the same curious eye to humans? To him, perhaps desire was just another natural phenomenon to be catalogued. To us, that reads as perversion. To him, maybe it was just science. Now here's a quirky fringe claim that floated around later. Some chroniclers insisted Frederick dabbled in alchemy of the body, attempting to mix lust with mystical rituals. They whispered he sought eternal youth through intimate acts, a kind of proto-tantric experiment. Was it true? Probably not, but it fed the medieval imagination perfectly. A king who wanted to live forever, trying to siphon vitality from his lovers? It sounds like something out of a Gothic romance, but it was very much the flavour of rumour his enemies loved to spread. And then comes the question of legacy. Was Frederick a pervert, or just a man centuries ahead of his time, blurring science and sensuality in ways the medieval church could never stomach? Modern historians often praise his intellect and cosmopolitan court, but even they can't shake off the lingering haze of gossip that painted him as both brilliant and bizarre. It's that duality, genius and pervert, that keeps his legend alive. As you leave Palermo's glittering palaces, the echo of fountains fading into the night, you carry with you the unsettling thought. What happens when curiosity has no boundaries? Frederick pushed that question further than most kings dared, and the whispers that followed him showed just how dangerous it was to mix knowledge with desire. But if Frederick experimented with love like a scientist, the next king you'll meet, Alfonso XI of Castile, approached it with brute force. He didn't want experiments. He wanted endless mistresses, an entire kingdom bending under the weight of his appetites. You slip now into Castile in the early 14th century, where Alfonso XI reigned from 1312 to 1350, a king who didn't so much dabble in scandal as drown in it. If Frederick II turned intimacy into a laboratory experiment, Alfonso turned it into an endless parade. He was called El Justiciero, the Avenger, for his talent in war and justice, but in private his reputation was less about swords and laws, and more about how many mistresses he could collect. Spoiler, the answer seemed to be as many as humanly possible. The king married young to Maria of Portugal. On paper it was the perfect alliance, Iberian crowns tied closer together. Dynastic power shored up, but Alfonso seemed spectacularly uninterested in marital fidelity. He treated the marriage bed like a polite formality, while his real passions ran elsewhere. Chroniclers list mistress after mistress, a glittering, overwhelming roster of noblewomen who caught his eye and found themselves installed at court. It got so out of hand that entire factions of the nobility started whispering not about politics or law, but about who was the king's favourite this week. One mistress, Leonor de Guzman, became legendary. Alfonso didn't just keep her quietly on the side, he elevated her into near queenly status. She bore him 10 children, lived openly at court, and was treated as his true consort, while the actual queen, Maria, sat humiliated in the shadows. Imagine the gossip, bishops muttering under their breath during mass, nobles rolling their eyes as Leonor strutted into feasts dripping in jewels, while the queen herself fumed in silence. The court wasn't just scandalous, it was a soap opera in full medieval costume. Here's a quirky tidbit. Alfonso supposedly used to summon Leonor during official councils, letting her whisper in his ear while advisors looked on. It was an outrageous breach of decorum, and it gave her a reputation as the real power behind the throne. To the medieval mind, this wasn't just lust, it was dangerous lust, corrupting the flow of politics. And when you live in a world where kings are supposed to reflect divine order, having your mistress run the government through pillow talk looks less like romance and more like apocalypse. Of course, not everyone agreed Leonor was a villain. Some chroniclers admitted she was intelligent, politically savvy, and fiercely loyal to Alfonso. But that only made things worse for Queen Maria, who seethed as her rival's influence grew. And here's where the scholarly debate comes in. Was Alfonso simply a lust-driven king blinded by beauty? Or did he see in Leonor a valuable political partner, who happened to also share his bear? Historians still argue. Some say his obsession with her destabilized the realm by alienating the queen and her allies. Others argue Leonor helped him govern more effectively, her presence a stabilizing force until his death. Still, the sheer scale of Alfonso's affairs was hard to ignore. His appetite seemed insatiable. Chroniclers record nobles and clergy complaining that he scandalized the court with his disordered life, parading mistresses with no shame, fathering children across Castile like confetti thrown at a parade. And while kings fathering illegitimate children wasn't unusual, Alfonso stood out because he flaunted it so brazenly. Where other rulers kept their affairs discreet, Alfonso practically set them on the throne beside him. Imagine walking into one of his banquets. Gold platters piled with roasted boar, goblets overflowing with wine, troubadours strumming in the corner. At the head table, Alfonso leans close to Leonor, laughing, as though the queen doesn't even exist. Meanwhile, half the courtiers murmur about her influence, the other half jockey for favour by currying attention from the king's many other lovers. It's less a royal feast than a catty reunition of competing mistresses, all smiling sweetly while sharpening invisible daggers. Quirky fringe rumour? Some gossips claimed Alfonso believed his virility was a sign of divine blessing, proof that God favoured his reign. It sounds absurd, but remember, medieval people often linked fertility to holiness. So while bishops condemned his adultery, some flatterers spun it the other way. Look at how many children the king sires. Surely this means heaven smiles upon him. That kind of twisted logic let Alfonso indulge without apology, and yet his behaviour had consequences. Queen Maria never forgave Leonor. After Alfonso's death in 1350, Maria struck back with vengeance. Leonor was captured, imprisoned, and eventually executed. It was as though decades of humiliation boiled over in one violent act. Leonor's sons, however, survived, and one of them, Henry of Trastamara, would eventually overthrow Alfonso's legitimate son, Pedro the Cruel, to seize the throne. In other words, Alfonso's lust didn't just cause scandal, it altered the entire trajectory of Castilian history. So here's the debate historians wrestle with. Was Alfonso XI truly a reckless king destroyed by his appetites? Or was he simply a ruler who happened to elevate the wrong mistress, creating dynastic chaos in the process? Either way, his reign proves how dangerous desire could be when woven into the fabric of monarchy. Lust wasn't just private, it was public, political, and dynastic. As you step out of Alfonso's glittering yet poisonous court, you can almost hear the echo of Leonor's laughter and Maria's grinding teeth. And as scandalous as his life was, the next English king we'll meet, Edward II, makes Alfonso look almost tame. Because Edward's story isn't just about mistresses, it's about a love so infamous, so controversial that it toppled alliances, sparked rebellions, and ended in one of the most gruesome downfalls in royal history. The wind shifts again, and you're back in England, this time in the early 14th century, staring straight at Edward II. If Alfonso XI filled his court with endless mistresses, Edward flipped the script. His great obsession wasn't a mistress at all, but a man named Piers Gaveston, a companion, confidant, and, according to centuries of rumour, lover. Their bond was so strong, so blatant, that it scandalised not just the clergy but the entire English nobility, who weren't used to kings parading favourites around like gilded trophies. Edward's reign, from 1307 to 1327, became less about governing a kingdom and more about a dangerous bromance that shook the monarchy to its core. Edward wasn't built for the role he inherited. His father, Edward IV, had been the hammer of the Scots, a towering, warlike king who commanded respect. Edward VII, he was softer, less martial, more interested in music, swimming, and his companions than in crushing enemies. Enter Piers Gaveston, handsome, witty. Flamboyant Gaveston was everything Edward adored. The two were inseparable, and Edward showered him with titles, lands, jewels, and most scandalously, public displays of affection. Chroniclers didn't mince the words. They described Edward doting on Gaveston beyond reason, to the point where barons muttered about unnatural love. Now here's a quirky detail. Gaveston was notorious for mocking the English nobility. He gave the great earls insulting nicknames, turned jousts into his personal stage, and strutted about in silks finer than the king himself. Imagine being a powerful earl, expecting deference, only to have the king's favourite laugh in your face while draped in jewels you paid for with your taxes. It didn't just look like favouritism, it looked like humiliation. And since Edward refused to rein Gaveston in, the nobles' hatred grew into a blazing fury, though historians still debate the exact nature of their relationship. Was it sexual? Many sources strongly hint at it, though none outright confirm it. Some scholars argue the language of the time exaggerated intimacy, that love could mean friendship rather than romance. Others counter that the sheer extravagance of Edward's devotion, combined with the venom of the nobles' complaints, points to more than platonic affection. The fact that chroniclers labelled Gaveston's influence perverse and unnatural suggests they believed something was happening that went beyond friendship. Whatever the truth, the perception alone was enough to shake Edward's rule. Picture a royal feast in Westminster Hall. The tables sag under venison and ale, nobles frown in silence, and then Edward bursts in with Gaveston at his side, laughing, his hand lingering too long on his companion's shoulder. He crowns him with jewels, gives him the choicest cuts of meat, and stares at him with the kind of devotion he never shows his queen. The silence at the high table thickens until you could cut it with a dagger. Somewhere down the line, an earl grips his cup hard enough to crack it, muttering under his breath that this insult cannot stand. Here's where the scandal becomes deadly serious. The barons forced Edward to exile Gaveston multiple times, but Edward always brought him back, as though no law or threat could keep them apart. Finally, in 1312 they snapped. Gaveston was captured, dragged before a group of enraged nobles and executed, beheaded in what was essentially a political murder. Edward was devastated, furious, humiliated. He never forgave the nobles, but he could never truly avenge Gaveston's death either. The loss hollowed him, and the shadow of that relationship haunted the rest of his reign. And the gossip didn't end there. After Gaveston's death, Edward grew close to other male favourites, most notoriously Hugh Despenser the Younger. If Gaveston had infuriated the nobility, the Despensers were gasoline on the fire. Edward's favouritism toward Hugh sparked rebellions, alienated allies, and deepened the sense that the king was ruled by his passions rather than his crown. Chroniclers sneered that the king preferred the embraces of men to the duties of his office. Whether literal or figurative, the accusation stuck. Here's a quirky fringe rumour. Some chroniclers claimed Edward had a fondness for manual labour and rustic hobbies, sometimes abandoning court to dig ditches or thatch roofs with peasants. To his enemies, this wasn't just eccentric, it was degrading. A king who played in mud by day and doted on male favourites by night? For the nobility, it was proof that Edward was unfit to rule. His reign became a rolling storm of scandal, rebellion and war. The scholarly debate rages on. Was Edward simply unlucky in his choice of companions, or was he genuinely undone by his desires? Some historians suggest his downfall came more from political ineptitude than from personal scandal. Others argue his open devotion to Gaveston and Despenser alienated the nobility beyond repair, making rebellion inevitable. And then, of course, there's the gruesome question of his death in 1327, captured, deposed and, according to lurid rumours, murdered with a red-hot poker as poetic punishment for his supposed unnatural desires. Was that true? Probably not. Modern scholars believe it was propaganda invented afterward. But the fact that it became the enduring story shows how deeply Edward's reign was tied to scandalous sexuality. As you step out of Edward's storm-tossed court, the whispers linger. Was he a tragic figure destroyed by love, or a reckless king who let desire blind him to the needs of his realm? Either way, his legacy is inseparable from the image of Piers Gaveston, the companion who toppled a kingdom. And if England was shocked by Edward's scandalous loves, Denmark was about to experience its own kind of royal perversion. Because Valdemar II, the so-called Valdemar the Victorious, mixed politics, kidnapping, and questionable passions in a way that made even hardened knights shake their heads. You find yourself in Denmark now, early 13th century, where King Valdemar II, nicknamed the Victorious, rules with sword in hand and scandal in tow. At first glance, Valdemar looks like your classic medieval monarch, warrior, lawgiver, and empire builder. He led campaigns against Slavs, extended Denmark's influence far into the Baltic, and seemed unstoppable. But beneath the armour, his personal life was riddled with affairs, questionable liaisons, and one especially infamous scandal that made chroniclers mutter that victorious might as well mean victorious in seduction. Valdemar married Dagmar of Bohemia, a beloved queen whose gentleness made her a folk hero in Danish ballads. But Dagmar's early death left Valdemar free to indulge, and indulge he did. He remarried to Berengaria of Portugal, but even that alliance couldn't keep him tethered. Rumours swirled that he kept mistresses at nearly every castle he visited, sometimes noble women, sometimes less than noble partners, each treated like temporary consorts before being discarded. Chroniclers complained that the king's progress through his lands left behind not just new laws but new scandals, each whispered from village to village. Here's the odd little quirky fact. Valdemar was actually kidnapped in 1223 while hunting on the island of Layo by Count Henry of Schwerin, one of his enemies. He was held prisoner for over 2 years. Now here's where the scandal comes in. While he was locked away, tales spread that his mistresses and companions smuggled themselves into his captivity, keeping him company in secret. Some versions claim that Valdemar bribed his guards not with gold but with favours and access to his lovers, turning captivity into something disturbingly indulgent. Whether true or not, the story fit too perfectly with his reputation to be ignored. The scandal got thicker when you looked at how openly he flaunted his passions once free. After Dagmar's death, the people adored her memory so much that they despised Berengaria, partly because she was seen as the reason Valdemar strayed further. Ballads later portrayed Dagmar begging him from her deathbed to avoid marrying Berengaria, predicting misery for the realm. Was that prophecy real? Maybe not, but it reflected how common folk interpreted the king's tangled love life. Even centuries later, Danish songs lamented that Dagmar was gone while Berengaria brought only sorrow and scandal. Picture a feast at Valdemar's court. The warriors sit at one side, still bloody from campaigns in Estonia, while minstrels strum ballads about noble queens and tragic deaths. But at the high table, Valdemar laughs with a woman who's very much not his wife, her fingers jewelled, her laughter echoing louder than the music. The knights exchange glances, the bishops frown, and the peasants sitting in smoky corners whisper that the king's heart belongs not to Denmark or even to God, but to whatever woman has caught his wandering eye that month. And here's where the scholarly debate comes in. Was Valdemar's personal life really scandalous, or was it simply exaggerated by later chroniclers nostalgic for Dagmar and bitter toward Berengaria? Some historians argue that the ballads praising Dagmar and vilifying Berengaria unfairly shaped his image, turning ordinary royal infidelity into legendary perversion. Others suggest the consistency of the gossip points to truth, that Valdemar was genuinely notorious for mixing his politics with his passions, rewarding mistresses with influence and alienating nobles in the process. The kidnapping episode too is debated. Was it purely political, or did the rumours about smuggled lovers reflect deeper truths about his priorities even in crisis? Here's a fringe but colourful rumour. Some later tales claimed Valdemar fathered illegitimate children while still imprisoned, supposedly by women sneaked into his cell. Logically, this sounds absurd, but in the popular imagination it captured exactly who Valdemar was. The king whose appetites couldn't be chained, not even by iron bars, a monarch who could conquer territories but couldn't conquer his own desires, The irony of Valdemar's reign is that militarily and politically, he really was victorious. He extended Denmark's reach more than any king before him, codified laws and left a legacy still remembered in Scandinavian history. Yet in the ballads sung long after his death, what lingers is not his conquests or his legal reforms, but his romantic scandals. Dagmar's tragic death, Berengaria's unpopularity, his endless mistresses, his rumoured dalliances, even in captivity, those became the stories people hummed by firelight. For a man called the Victorious, his memory is more often tied to love and lust than to empire. As you drift out of Valdemar's smoky hall, the sound of ballads fading into the night, you realise how often kings' reputations were rewritten by rumour and song. One queen's death, one mistress's laughter, one whispered scandal could eclipse entire campaigns. And the next monarch waiting for you, Sigismund of Luxembourg, Holy Roman Emperor and self-proclaimed stag party enthusiast, shows exactly how a royal life of hunting, drinking and bawdy revelry could become a national spectacle of perversion. Now you're stepping into the sprawling, chaotic orbit of Sigismund of Luxembourg, King of Hungary, King of Germany, Holy Roman Emperor and part-time party planner for the late medieval world. His reign spanned the late 14th and early 15th centuries, and though he did plenty of serious kingly things, organising councils, fighting wars, trying to keep Christendom stitched together, his personal reputation was seasoned with a heavy dose of hunting, drinking and the kind of rowdy behaviour that made sober-minded bishops groan. If Edward II was destroyed by love and Valdemar II by affairs, Sigismund's scandal lay in the sheer scale of his revelry. His court looked less like a council chamber and more like a medieval frat house with better outfits. Sigismund was flamboyant from the start. He loved display, pomp and excess, and his hunting expeditions were legendary. These weren't polite little deer hunts. They were massive affairs lasting weeks, where nobles, mistresses, falconers, musicians and cooks all trailed through forests while bonfires blazed by night. And once the hunting horns were silent, the real festivities began. Chronicles describe nights of feasting, drinking and bawdy entertainments so scandalous that later writers tried to dress them up as customs of the time. But the truth? His hunting parties doubled as rolling festivals of lust. Here's the quirky fact. Sigismund was obsessed with the imagery of stags. Not only did he hunt them obsessively, but he also styled himself in antlers, embroidering them onto clothes, stamping them onto crests, and even incorporating them into lavish feasts. To his enemies, this was hilarious, because in medieval symbolism, antlers also hinted at cuckoldry. A king strutting around with antlers embroidered on his sleeves practically begged for satirical whispers. Some wits joked that his parties were less about hunting stags and more about hunting bedmates. But what made his reputation stick wasn't just the hunting or the drinking, it was the way women were folded into his festivities. Chroniclers grumbled that Sigismund filled his court with ladies of loose repute, parading them through hunting camps like prizes. At banquets, he supposedly handed out extravagant gifts, rings, gowns, even horses, to women who caught his eye, regardless of whether they were married to someone else. Imagine a solemn bishop watching as the emperor gifted a jewelled necklace to a giggling woman, while her husband sat red-faced 2 seats down. It was the kind of scene that practically wrote its own gossip. Of course, historians argue over how much of this was true. Sigismund was an emperor constantly at odds with factions of nobility and clergy, so smearing him as lustful was an easy political weapon. But the consistency of reports suggests at least some fire beneath the smoke. Even at the Council of Constance, one of the most important church councils in history tasked with ending the Great Schism, rumours swirled that Sigismund filled the town with revelry. Picture it, bishops and theologians debating the unity of Christendom by day, only to hear the emperor throwing wild feasts by night, antlers gleaming in torchlight as laughter and music spilled into the streets. Another curious thread. Sigismund was known for his extravagant dress. He adored bright colours, long flowing robes, and jewels that glittered outrageously. In an age where monarchs were supposed to embody sober Christian virtue, his peacock-like appearance gave critics plenty of ammunition. If his clothes are this excessive, they whispered, imagine what his nights are like. Again, the line between fashion and perversion blurred easily in the medieval rumour mill. And here's a fringe rumour to top it off. Some claim that Sigismund invented strange drinking rituals, requiring nobles and mistresses alike to pass cups with kisses, toasts and whispered oaths, It sounds like innocent party fun to us, but to medieval moralists it looks like dangerous decadence. To share a cup was to share a bond, and Sigismund's endless rounds of kissing games struck critics as little more than organised debauchery. Whether true or exaggerated, the story fit perfectly with his persona as the stag lord of Europe, bounding from bedchamber to banquet without pause. The scholarly debate lingers on whether Sigismund's court was uniquely scandalous or simply typical of late medieval monarchs who all enjoyed their share of indulgence. Some historians argue that his reputation was exaggerated by political enemies, pointing out that he was actually quite capable in diplomacy and governance. Others note that even his allies admitted his love of excess, suggesting that while not uniquely depraved, he leaned into it harder than most. So imagine yourself staggering out of one of his hunting feasts. The firelight flickers on antlers mounted to trees, the smell of roasted venison clings to your clothes, and somewhere in the distance the Emperor himself is laughing too loudly, his jewelled robes brushing against the muddy ground as he heads back into a tent where music and scandal still roar. This is power, Sigismund style. Loud, indulgent, and utterly unconcerned, with the moralists frowning from their prayer stools. But excess always casts shadows, and as you move away from the staghorn bonfires, the next king you'll meet, James IV of Scotland, takes us into a realm where indulgence mixes not only with mistresses, but with mystical rituals, confessions and penance. A man torn between lust and guilt, passion and piety, whose bedroom life reads like a tug of war with his own soul. Step softly now into the damp stone halls of Scotland, where James IV reigns at the turn of the 16th century. If Sigismund of Luxembourg roared through Europe with staghorns and drinking games, James was a quieter storm, restless, brilliant, deeply charismatic, but caught in a strange tug-of-war between his passions and his piety. He ruled Perverted from 1488 to 1513, a king who strengthened Scotland politically and culturally, but whose private life was so tangled in mistresses, guilt and rituals of penance that it reads like a diary torn in half. On one page, lust. On the other, confession and blood. James was young when he seized the crown, only 15, and right away he was haunted by guilt. Why? Because his father, James III, had died in battle against rebels who had rallied under James IV's name. The boy king hadn't swung the fatal blow, but he carried the weight of it forever. That guilt drove him into cycles of indulgence and penance. He'd take mistresses with abandon, father illegitimate children across the kingdom, then turn around and scourge himself in religious rituals, as though trying to balance sin with suffering. Imagine a king who'd leave his lover's chamber one night and the next morning walk barefoot to church, whipping his own back until it bled. Here's a quirky fact. James IV wore an iron chain around his waist, adding links each year as penance for his father's death. It clinked under his royal robes, a constant reminder of guilt rubbing against flesh. Now picture that chain rattling as he embraced yet another mistress, a living symbol of contradiction. Chroniclers couldn't resist pointing out the irony. The King of Scotland, tangled in both lust and remorse, the chain of sin and the chain of penance clashing with every step. James's appetite for women was legendary. He fathered at least 7 illegitimate children, recognised openly and provided for. Unlike other kings who tried to hide their bastards, James paraded his with pride, granting them titles and lands. His most famous mistress was Margaret Drummond, a noblewoman who became so prominent that many whispered she was his true love, even more than his eventual queen, Margaret Tudor, sister of Henry VIII. For a time, Drummond and her sisters lived at court with the king, a setup so scandalous that it made enemies sneer that Scotland had 3 queens instead of 1. And then came the tragedy that turned rumour into legend. Margaret Drummond and her sisters died suddenly in 1501 after a meal, possibly poisoned. Was it food gone bad or a political assassination to clear the way for James's marriage to Margaret Tudor? Historians still debate it. To the people it looked like a dark punishment for the king's indulgence, his beloved mistress removed by fate or poison, leaving him to atone once more. Even now, the Drummond sisters' graves in Dunblane whisper of a scandal wrapped in mystery. Picture James at a feast in Stirling Castle. The great hall is filled with music, nobles jostling for favour, the scent of roasted meat swirling with candle smoke. At the high table, James leans close to Margaret Drummond, his chain hidden under silks, while the Queen-to-be waits in the political wings. Laughter echoes. but somewhere beneath it is the hiss of gossip. The king sins and the chain grows heavier. In one corner, a priest mutters a prayer. In another, a courtier sharpens a scheme. The air is thick with both romance and threat. The debate about James IV is fascinating because it cuts both ways. Some historians see him as a deeply human king, a man of passion who balanced his flaws with genuine remorse, almost modern in his contradictions. Others argue his indulgences weakened his rule, distracted him from governance, and entangled him in scandals like Drummond's mysterious death. Was he perverted? Maybe not in the wild Rufus sense, but certainly caught in cycles of lust and penitence that shaped his reign as much as his politics. And here's a fringe rumour that adds spice to the story. Some later writers claimed James dabbled in alchemy and occult practices, seeking hidden knowledge in secret chambers. Was it true? Hard to say, but given his mix of intellectual curiosity and personal guilt, it's not hard to imagine him summoning strange rituals to ease his conscience or his desires. Scotland's later reputation for mysticism often traces back to whispers about kings like James. The irony is that James was also a patron of the Renaissance, bringing learning, art and innovation into Scotland. He could debate theology with scholars one moment, then tumble into bed with a mistress the next. Then rise at dawn to scourge himself bloody in penance. His reign was a rhythm of contradiction, a king chained both by guilt and by his passions. In the end, James met a tragic death at the Battle of Flodden in 1513, leading his army personally against the English. His body was found among the fallen, his chain of penance still around his waist. To some, it was poetic, the king who sinned and repented in equal measure, cut down in the middle of his contradictions. As you step out of Stirling's echoing halls, you can almost hear the rattle of that chain, heavy with both lust and regret. And the next king waiting in the wings, Wenceslaus IV of Bohemia, offers no such balance. Where James was torn between sin and sorrow, Wenceslaus simply embraced excess. Drunken revels, tavern brawls, and gossip that made him the medieval equivalent of a rock star spiralling out of control. Step eastward now into the heart of Bohemia at the end of the 14th century, where Wenceslaus IV sits on the throne, or more often, stumbles out of a tavern. He was King of Bohemia from 1378, and also held the title of King of the Romans, which technically made him heir to the Holy Roman Empire. In theory, he should have been the serious statesman holding Christendom together. In practice, Wenceslaus was better known for drunken revels, impulsive brawls, and a scandalous disregard for the dignity of kingship. If James IV was torn by guilt, Wenceslaus seemed allergic to it. He leaned fully into indulgence, and his court became notorious for wine, laughter, and whispered tales of lust. Wenceslaus was the son of Charles IV, one of the most respected emperors in medieval history. Imagine being born with that kind of shadow over you. Instead of following in his father's stately footsteps, Wenceslaus developed a reputation for being lazy, unpredictable, and obsessed with pleasure. Chroniclers complain that he neglected government, skipped councils, and left nobles waiting while he drank himself into oblivion. And when he wasn't in the tavern, he was allegedly in the bedchamber, his own or someone else's. The contrast between Charles IV, the statesman, and Wenceslaus, the tavern king, became a running joke across Europe. Here's a quirky little fact. Wenceslaus loved fishing. Not just as a hobby, but as an excuse to ditch official duties. Ambassadors and nobles would show up expecting a royal audience, only to be told, "Sorry, His Majesty's gone fishing." Sometimes he took mistresses or drinking companions along, turning a quiet pastime into a floating party on the river. In a way, fishing became his metaphor for kingship. Bait a hook, pour some wine and see what bites. The gossip practically wrote itself. His court was infamous for drunken revels. Chroniclers claim he surrounded himself with a circle of drinking buddies, many of them low-born, who encouraged his excesses. At night, the King of Bohemia could be found staggering through Prague's taverns, slapping backs, shouting songs, and challenging strangers to drinking contests. And where there's drunkenness, there's gossip. Stories circulated of women smuggled into these feasts, of brawls that ended with blood on the cobblestones, and of the king himself passed out under a table while servants scrambled to cover him with cloaks. One particularly scandalous tale involves Wenceslaus abducting the daughter of a nobleman after a night of drinking, supposedly keeping her at court for days before returning her disgraced. Was it true? Harder to know. Chroniclers love to blend fact with exaggeration, especially when painting Wenceslaus as unfit for rule. But the rumour stuck, adding perverted abductor to his already messy resume. His political enemies certainly didn't mind, and that's where the scholarly debate sparks. Was Wenceslaus truly the debauched wreck chroniclers painted him as? Or was this the product of political propaganda? He faced fierce opposition from nobles and church leaders who deposed him more than once. Smearing him as a drunkard and a libertine made rebellion easier to justify. Modern historians argue that while Wenceslaus certainly indulged heavily, his enemies exaggerated his vices to make him look like a medieval Caligula. The truth, as always, likely lies somewhere between. A king who loved drink and pleasure too much, but whose scandals were sharpened by politics into something monstrous. Here's a quirky fringe rumour. Some chroniclers claimed Wenceslaus kept a pet bear that accompanied him to drinking bouts, trained to drink ale from a tankard. Whether it's true or not, the image is too good. The King of Bohemia, red-faced and roaring with laughter. Clinking mugs with a bear while nobles fume about missed council meetings. It's the kind of story that makes you wonder if history is trolling us. Imagine yourself walking into Prague Castle on a feast night. The great hall is smoky with torches, the air thick with roasted meats and spilled ale. Nobles try to maintain dignity, but the king is slouched in his chair, crown askew, wine dripping down his beard as he shouts for another round. Courtiers whisper nervously as women in jewelled gowns slip between tables, laughter rising above the music. And somewhere in the chaos, someone's sword clatters to the floor as a drunken fight breaks out. This isn't a court, it's a tavern with better wallpaper. But Wenceslaus's indulgence wasn't harmless. His neglect of politics weakened Bohemia, deepened divisions, and paved the way for the Hussite wars that would erupt after his death. In that sense, his private scandals had public consequences. A king who treated the throne like a bar stool couldn't hold together a kingdom simmering with religious and political unrest. His pleasures became his downfall. So, as you stumble out of Wenceslaus's smoky feast hall, ears ringing with drunken songs, the lesson sinks in. Some kings are destroyed by forbidden loves, others by guilt. But Wenceslaus was undone simply by excess. And yet, if you think he was dangerous in his indulgence, wait until you meet Erik IV of Sweden, the king whose jealous obsessions and violent passions turned love into something truly lethal. Now the scene shifts northward, into the forests and icy waters of 16th century Sweden, where Erik XIV ruled from 1560 to 1568. His reign is a tangle of brilliance, paranoia, and obsession, a king whose passions tipped over into madness. If Wenceslaus of Bohemia drank himself into scandal, Erik burned himself alive on jealousy and desire. His private life wasn't just messy, it was dangerous, turning affection into paranoia and love into bloodshed. Erik was the son of Gustav Vasa, Sweden's great liberator, and like so many heirs of powerful fathers, he struggled to step out of the shadow. At first, he seemed a promising Renaissance prince, educated, fluent in languages, fascinated by astronomy, literature, and art. But his private appetites and erratic temperament soon eclipsed all of that. Chroniclers whisper of obsessions with women, outbursts of violent jealousy, and a tendency to see betrayal lurking behind every romantic glance. One of his most famous entanglements was with Karin Monsdotter, a commoner who became his mistress, and eventually, against all convention, his queen. Their relationship scandalized the Swedish nobility. A king was supposed to marry for alliance, not love, and certainly not to a woman of humble birth. But Erik was besotted, flaunting her at court, showering her with jewels, and ignoring noble women of proper pedigree. Imagine the gossip, counts and bishops grinding their teeth while the king paraded his mistress-turned-queen through feasts as if she were born in silk. Here's a quirky detail. Erik reportedly had Karin sing to him when his paranoia flared. He believed her voice soothed his rages, like a charm against madness. Chroniclers describe nights where he paced the palace halls, muttering dark suspicions about conspiracies, until Karin's singing calmed him enough to sleep. It sounds almost tender, until you remember that the next morning he might lash out at courtiers he suspected of glancing at her too fondly. The violence came to a head in what became known as the Sture murders. In 1567, convinced that the noble Sture family was plotting against him, Erik had several of them arrested. During a paranoid fit, he personally stabbed one of them to death and ordered the execution of the others. Blood ran across the castle stones, all while the court recoiled in horror. What does this have to do with his private life? Everything. Eric's jealous obsessions, fueled by suspicion that his lovers and favourites might betray him, bled directly into his political paranoia. Desire for him was inseparable from fear. Scholars debate the extent of his perversion. Was Eric truly lust-mad, or was he simply mentally ill in a world that interpreted erratic behaviour through the lens of sin? Some historians argue his passions weren't unusually indulgent. He had fewer mistresses than Alfonso XI, for example, but that his uncontrollable jealousy and violent fits turned otherwise ordinary royal lust into something far more destructive. Others suggest that Eric's enemies exaggerated his instability to justify his eventual deposition, painting him as both perverse and insane. The truth likely lies in the overlap. A brilliant but fragile king undone by his inability to separate love from fear. Here's a fringe rumour that circulated. Eric supposedly experimented with love potions and aphrodisiacs, dabbling in alchemy to keep his desires burning. Whether that's true or just a slander is impossible to say, but the image is vivid. A paranoid king sipping strange brews in candlelit chambers, hoping for eternal passion, while his mind slipped further into chaos. Picture the Swedish court under Eric. The great hall glitters with tapestries, nobles trying to smile while their king stares daggers at anyone who dares glance at Karin. A musician strums nervously, eyes darting to the door in case another jealous rage erupts. At the high table, Karin tries to soothe Eric, her voice lilting, while courtiers whisper prayers that tonight won't end in blood. The tension is thick enough to choke on, desire turned into danger, love chained to suspicion. Eventually, Eric's paranoia and scandal caught up with him. In 1568, his own brothers led a coup, deposing him and locking him away. He died a few years later, likely poisoned, ironically by the same kinds of substances he once toyed with. His romance with Karin, his obsessions, his jealous fits, all of it ended in confinement and death, leaving a legacy equal parts tragic and scandalous. So as you step away from Eric's snowbound palace, the echoes of Karin's soft singing fading into the night, you realise how perilous passion could be when bound up with madness. Some kings drank, some flaunted, some paraded mistresses, but Eric weaponised desire, turning it into paranoia that spilled blood. And the next monarch you'll meet, the so-called Proto-Henry VIII figures of late medieval Europe, show how the obsession with wives, heirs and lust had set the stage for one of history's most notorious royal perverts. The thread of our journey now takes you to the late medieval kings who walked so Henry VIII could, well, chop heads and collect wives like trophies. Long before Henry thundered through England in the 16th century with his notorious appetite, there were monarchs laying the groundwork, figures whose obsessions with heirs, mistresses, and marital chaos foreshadowed his brand of royal perversion. These kings didn't reach Henry's level of theatrical cruelty, but their tangled love lives and lust-driven politics carved the path for him. One of the clearest prototypes was Edward IV of England, who reigned during the Wars of the Roses in the mid-15th century. Edward was tall, handsome and charismatic, with a reputation for charm that drew noble women and commoners alike into his orbit. Chroniclers complain that he was constantly distracted by mistresses, pulling women into his chambers even in the middle of political crises. His appetite was legendary, so much so that he once earned the mocking nickname, the Harbinger of Venus. Imagine that, a king known more for his bedroom than his battlefield. Edward's most scandalous act of passion was marrying Elizabeth Woodville, a commoner widow, in secret. It shocked the nobility, who expected him to marry a foreign princess for alliance. Instead, Edward followed his desire, elevating Elizabeth and her entire family into positions of power. To his supporters, it was romantic. To his enemies, it was reckless lust masquerading as love. The court bristled with resentment, whispering that Edward was ruled not by policy but by his queen's bedroom. Sound familiar? Henry VIII would later marry for love, or lust, in equally disruptive ways, ignoring politics to satisfy his desires. Here's a quirky fact about Edward. He was so open about his mistresses that one of them, Jane Shore, became a kind of folk heroine. Described as witty, beautiful and influential, she was beloved even by the people, who forgave her sin because she was gracious and charitable. Imagine the spectacle, a king's mistress walking through London, cheered by the crowd as though she were queen. For medieval moralists, this was outrageous. For Henry VIII, it was practically a blueprint. Surround yourself with mistresses and legitimise them through sheer force of personality. But Edward wasn't alone. Louis XI of France, reigning around the same time, had his own tangled reputation. Known as the Spider King for his webs of political intrigue, he allegedly spun similar webs in his personal life, keeping mistresses in different castles and rewarding them with influence. Chroniclers accused him of indulgence cloaked in secrecy, a man whose hidden romances mirrored his shadowy political schemedom. Again you see the pattern, rulers turning desire into a political tool, letting mistresses serve as both companions and pawns. Scholars debate whether these late medieval kings were truly more perverted than their peers, or whether shifting ideas of monarchy made their scandals more visible. By the 15th century, courts were becoming more centralised, chroniclers more detailed, and gossip more widely circulated. What earlier kings could hide in monasteries and castles, men like Edward IV and Louis XI had paraded across kingdoms. Was it really more indulgence, or just more documentation? Historians wrestle with that question. Here's a fringe rumour that clings to Edward IV. Some claimed he secretly married another woman, Eleanor Butler, before marrying Elizabeth Woodville. If true, it would mean his later marriage was invalid, a scandalous revelation that Richard III used to justify seizing the throne. Was Edward simply careless in love, or deliberately perverse in juggling promises of marriage? Either way, the accusation cemented his image as a king driven more by lust than law. Picture yourself at Edward IV's court. The great hall glitters with Yorkist banners, but the tension hums beneath the music. Elizabeth Woodville sits at the high table, serene but watchful, while Jane Shore whispers to nobles at the edges, her influence almost as strong as the Queen's. Edward strides in, tall and magnetic, but his eyes wander from face to face, already seeking his next conquest. Behind the pomp, everyone knows the truth. Policy bends where passion points. That is the inheritance Henry VIII would later seize with both hands. Edward IV's reckless marriage and endless mistresses, Louis XI's hidden webs of lust, even rumours around kings like Charles VI, whom we'll meet later. They all formed the prologue to the Tudor soap opera. By the time Henry arrived, Europe was already primed for a monarch whose lust shaped dynasties. As you step away from these proto-Henry figures, the echoes of their passions ripple forward. Their scandals didn't just stain their reigns, they normalised the idea that kings could reshape nations for desire's sake. And the next ruler waiting in our midnight walk, Ladislaus of Naples, carried that idea to a new level. A monarch so obsessed with seduction that he earned the title the Ladies' King, rewriting politics through his scandalous conquests. Now the road takes you south into the sun-drenched, tempestuous world of Naples in the early 15th century, where Ladislaus of Naples strutted across the stage like some medieval Casanova. He reigned from 1386 to 1414, a man who wrapped himself in velvet, carried a sword in one hand, and apparently kept the other free for whoever happened to catch his eye. Chroniclers called him Il Re delle Donne, the Ladies' King. Wasn't meant as a compliment. It was shorthand for a ruler who tangled politics and seduction so tightly that you couldn't tell if he was making alliances or simply making advances. Ladislaus came to power young, inheriting the throne after his father's violent end, and almost immediately rumours of his appetites began to circulate. Unlike some kings who kept their affairs discreet, Ladislaus flaunted them with theatrical flair. His palace in Naples became a revolving door of noble women, courtesans, and even nuns, if you believe the juiciest of the whispers. The court was less a council of state and more a parade of lovers, each vying for the king's attention, while bishops wrung their hands in horror. Here's a quirky fact. Ladislaus reportedly loved staging elaborate tournaments where the prizes were not only gold or armour, but the favour of whichever woman the king decreed most beautiful that day. He would personally crown the winner with flowers and sometimes invite her to discuss matters privately afterward. Picture the spectacle, knights battered and bruised from combat, only to watch their ladies swept into the king's orbit, as though the joust itself had been foreplay for royal conquest. His most infamous scandal involved his invasion of Rome. In 1413, Ladislaus marched his armies into the Eternal City, and, instead of acting as a solemn conqueror, was accused of turning the capture into a debauch. Stories spread that he filled the city with mistresses and revels, treating Rome itself like a personal playground. Some said he used the papal palaces for feasts that blended politics with seduction, inviting women of every station into his retinue. The church was horrified. For centuries afterward, chroniclers painted him as the king who profaned the sacred city with his lust. But here's where the scholarly debate simmers. Was Ladislaus truly so depraved, or was he smeared because of his constant clashes with the papacy? He was ambitious, always manoeuvring to expand his control over central Italy. His enemies in the church had every reason to exaggerate his lusts to frame him as unfit and ungodly. Modern historians note that while he certainly kept mistresses, the scale of the scandal may have been inflated to justify resistance against him. Was he a medieval Lothario, or simply a victim of bad press? Scholars can't quite agree, yet even if exaggerated, his reputation shaped politics. Nobles allied or opposed him, based not just on his military campaigns, but on how he treated their wives, daughters, and sisters. Imagine being a duke at Ladislaus's court. You arrive to negotiate taxes, only to realise the king has been making eyes at your sister across the banquet table. Do you risk insult by confronting him, or swallow your pride in exchange for favour? That tension defined his court, turning desire into a weapon sharper than steel. Fringe rumour time, some chroniclers claimed Ladislaus maintained a private harem hidden within his palaces, filled with women from across Italy and beyond, whom he rotated through his chambers like a lord sampling fine wines. Was it real? Probably not. Most of those tales came from bitter opponents, but the image stuck. The lady's king presiding over a secret paradise of lust while priests muttered curses outside the gates. Picture a feast in Naples under Ladislaus. The hall glitters with chandeliers, the air heady with spiced wine and roasted meats. Laughter rings from one corner as courtesans flirt with the armoured knights. At the high table, Ladislaus lounges like a predator, scanning the room until his eyes land on a young noblewoman. Within moments, a servant discreetly delivers her father an invitation. The king wishes to see her after supper. The father stiffens, torn between fury and ambition, while the court buzzes with whispers. In that moment, you see how Ladislaus wielded desire as a tool of rule, bending everyone to his will through charm, threat, and scandal. In the end, Ladislaus's reign burned brightly but briefly. He died suddenly in 1414 at just 38, some whispering that poison took him down, a fittingly scandalous end for a king so steeped in rumour. His death left Naples reeling, his sister Joanna stepping in amid the chaos. But his legacy lingered, a monarch remembered less for victories and laws than for the endless list of women drawn into his orbit. So Mert, as you leave Naples with the echoes of laughter and clinking goblets still in your ears, the lesson is clear: Ladislaus's throne was built as much on seduction as on steel, and the next monarch you'll meet, John II of Aragon, proves how accusations of strange fetishes and cruel love games could twist a king's image into something darker still, where perversion wasn't just about pleasure, but about power laced with cruelty. Your path winds now into Aragon in the 15th century, where John the Cut reigned from 1458 to 1479. Unlike Ladislaus of Naples, who wore his appetite like a crown, John's scandal seeped in through whispers of cruelty and fetishes, the kind of rumours that made courtiers look at the floor rather than the throne. He was a calculating monarch, pragmatic and stubborn, remembered for his wars with Catalonia and his role as father of Ferdinand, yes, the same Ferdinand who later married Isabella and launched Spain into empire. But John's private life? It was a web of dark gossip, tales of twisted love games, hidden mistresses, and punishments that blurred the line between discipline and perversion. John's first marriage, to Blanche of Navarre, was politically strategic, but the union turned sour quickly. Chroniclers say John humiliated her, sidelined her rights as queen, and eventually denied her the throne of Navarre in favour of their son. It wasn't just politics, it was cruelty framed as control. Whispers began that John took pleasure not just in sidelining Blanche's authority, but in tormenting her emotionally, treating her less as a partner and more as a pawn. When she died in 1441, rumours swirled that her suffering was part of his design. His second marriage to Juana Enriquez added fuel to the fire. Juana was politically savvy and ambitious, but gossip said their relationship was fueled as much by shared cruelty as by love. Chroniclers hostile to John painted her as his accomplice in strange games of power, where rivals, sometimes even women of the court, were humiliated at feasts for the king's amusement. Was this true or just propaganda from Catalan rebels who despised him? Hard to say, but the story stuck, giving John's court an air of decadence laced with menace. Here's a quirky fact. John reportedly had an obsession with hunting falcons and staging elaborate displays of dominance with them. Now, falconry was a royal pastime across Europe, but in John's case, enemies claimed he extended the symbolism into his love life, treating women like falcons, chained, trained, and displayed at his pleasure. Was this literal or just metaphor? Scholars still debate, but the metaphor was juicy enough for chroniclers to spread. What makes John stand out in the Hall of Scandal isn't the sheer number of mistresses, though he certainly had those, but the cruelty woven into the rumours. One tale claimed he forced noble women into degrading tests of loyalty, making them endure humiliations at court before rewarding them with favour. Another suggested he encouraged rivals' wives to betray their husbands, not just for lust, but to prove his dominance. Imagine the scene. A feast in Zaragoza, the king smiling coldly as a noblewoman blushes under the weight of his command while her husband watches helplessly. Whether fact or fiction, such stories painted John less as a lover and more as a tyrant in the bedroom. The scholarly debate here is sharp. Some argue John's reputation for perversion was crafted by his enemies in Catalonia, who despised his centralising policies and needed a moral excuse to rebel. They exaggerated his mistreatment of Blanche, his relationship with Juana, and his supposed fetishes to cast him as a monster. Others argue there's too much consistency in the reports to dismiss. John was by all accounts a ruthless man in politics. It doesn't strain belief to think his ruthlessness spilled into private life. Here's a fringe rumour. Later chroniclers whispered that John enjoyed elaborate punishments involving masked banquets, where courtiers were forced to participate in degrading theatrics for his amusement. Picture nobles in ridiculous costumes, forced into roles while the king laughed from his high seat. True? Probably not, but in a world where humiliation was political currency, the rumour made perfect symbolic sense. Now imagine yourself in John's court. The hall is dim, the air heavy with incense and unease. The king sits with Juana at his side, their eyes sharp, scanning the nobles like predators picking prey. A hush falls as a young woman is called forward, her fate dangling between royal whim and political necessity. Laughter breaks out at her expense, the courtiers joining in because silence could mean suspicion. In that moment, you see what the gossip meant. A court where desire and cruelty dance together. John's legacy is complicated. He secured his dynasty, passed the crown to Ferdinand, and through him helped forge modern Spain. But the whispers of his private cruelty never faded. He wasn't remembered as a merry seducer like Ladislaus or a flamboyant reveller like Rufus. He was remembered as something darker, a king who may have found perverse pleasure in control, humiliation, and dominance. As you leave the cold echo of his court behind, the air feels heavier, the rumours clinging like smoke, and then, ahead, another ruler emerges, Matthias Corvinus of Hungary. Brilliant, cultured, a Renaissance prince, but one whose private pleasures, if the whispers are to be believed, strayed into shadows that made even his admirers raise eyebrows. Now the path bends eastward again, into the glittering, muscular court of Matthias Corvinus of Hungary, who reigned from 1458 to 1490. He's remembered as one of the most brilliant rulers of the late Middle Ages, patron of the arts, collector of books, commander of the famed Black Army, and a man who tried to drag Hungary into the Renaissance with one hand while swinging a sword with the other. And yet, behind the polished image of a Renaissance prince, rumours painted Matthias as a king whose appetites sometimes slipped into darker pleasures. Tales of secret chambers, mistresses hidden behind gilded doors, and whispers of strange tastes that gave his enemies plenty to gossip about. Matthias was young when he rose to the throne, chosen by nobles after years of civil war. From the start, he tried to present himself as a model ruler, disciplined, cultured, and devout. But power in medieval Hungary was as fragile as a crystal goblet, and Matthias quickly learned that public image mattered as much as battlefield victories. That's where the tension begins. In public, the wise king; in private, according to chroniclers, a man who indulged his passions with a vigour that clashed with his carefully crafted facade. One of his most infamous relationships was with Barbara Edelfuck, a commoner who became his mistress early in his reign. Unlike many kings who kept mistresses tucked away in shadows, Matthias elevated Barbara to a position of startling prominence. He paraded her openly, showered her with gifts, and gave her influence at court. The problem? Barbara was not of noble blood, and the Hungarian aristocracy fumed. Chroniclers hostile to Matthias claimed Barbara indulged in unusual games with the king, hinting at fetishistic scenarios that made her sound like a corrupter rather than a consort. Whether true or not, the rumours were sticky enough to cast Matthias's court as decadent. Here's a quirky fact. Matthias adored riddles and games of wit. At court, he often tested scholars and poets with clever puzzles. Now, some rumours spun this into something bawdier, that he extended his love of tests into the bedroom, treating intimacy as a puzzle to be solved or a contest to be won. Picture the Renaissance king leaning over a chessboard, then carrying that same competitive energy into a chamber where the rules became much stranger. Was this real or just enemies' invention? Scholars are divided. His later marriage to Beatrice of Naples, a cultured and politically astute queen, added another layer. Beatrice brought Italian Renaissance flair to Budapest, filling the court with artists, philosophers, and new fashions. But while she dazzled in public, whispers claimed Matthias still preferred his hidden mistresses, whose allure came less from noble blood and more from indulging his secret appetites. Some even suggested Beatrice herself dabbled in strange rituals with him, a rumour fuelled by her Italian connections and the suspicion that Italians were too fond of exotic pleasures. And here's where the scholarly debate heats up. Was Matthias truly perverted, or was his reputation a smear campaign by nobles who resented his centralising policies? Modern historians note that many of the juiciest rumours about Barbara Edelfuck and his supposed fetishes come from later sources, written by enemies, but others argue that his open flaunting of Barbara, combined with his reputation for eccentric tastes, suggests there was at least some truth. The balance between propaganda and reality is tricky, just as it is with nearly every king on this midnight stroll. Picture Matthias's palace at Buda. The halls gleam with marble and frescoes, artists debate theology in one corner, and soldiers of the Black Army clank their cups in another. But behind a guarded door, whispers say there's a chamber hung with velvet, where the king retreats with chosen companions. Some rumours said he preferred elaborate costumes, others that he played roles in strange bedroom dramas. It's impossible to know what was real, but the fact that people believed it shows how Matthias's image of cultured brilliance was undercut by gossip of shadowy indulgence. Here's a fringe rumour that survived into legend. Matthias supposedly kept a cabinet of secrets, filled with odd objects and manuscripts related to love and desire, collected from Italy and the East. Some chroniclers claimed he studied these texts as earnestly as he did his beloved books of law and history. Was this Renaissance curiosity or something darker? To his admirers, it was proof of his wide-ranging mind. To his critics, it was evidence of perversion disguised as scholarship. And yet, despite the whispers, Matthias was admired by his people. He became known as Matthias the Just, celebrated for reforms and fairness. Folktales even cast him as a disguised wanderer testing the honesty of his subjects. The irony is sharp. The same man painted as secretly perverse was adored as a symbol of justice. Perhaps that's what makes him fascinating. He straddled both worlds, brilliant and indulgent, just and rumoured to be twisted. In the end, Matthias died without a legitimate heir, leaving Hungary vulnerable. His brilliant reign collapsed into chaos, but the stories of his private indulgences lingered like smoke. Was he a true Renaissance pervert, or just a victim of noble slander? Either way, the image of the just king with a secret chamber of lust remains one of history's strangest contradictions. As you step out of Matthias's glittering palace, the marble fading into moonlight, the sound of riddles and laughter lingers, but the road ahead is bloodier. Because the next king waiting in the shadows is Sigurd the Crusader, a warrior king whose passion for the Holy War was matched only by his notorious indulgence in nightly debauchery. Now the path turns toward the cold fjords of Norway, early in the 12th century, where King Sigurd I, better known as Sigurd the Crusader, takes the stage. His nickname sounds noble enough, a Christian warrior who led Norwegians to the Holy Land during the Crusades. But like so many of our midnight companions, Sigurd's legend comes wrapped in both honour and scandal. For every tale of battlefield valour, there's another of wild feasts, drunken brawls and indulgences that made churchmen whisper that the Crusader's cross around his neck was competing with something far less holy in his chambers. Sigurd's claim to fame was being the first European king to personally lead a crusade to Jerusalem. In 1107, he set out with 60 ships, cutting a path through England, Spain, and the Mediterranean before reaching the Holy Land. The chronicles celebrate his victories, his alliances, his audience with King Baldwin of Jerusalem. But in between those victories were the voyages themselves, long stretches filled with feasting wine, and encounters that turned the Crusader fleet into a floating carnival of indulgence. Chroniclers hint that Sigurd treated the journey as both pilgrimage and pleasure cruise, conquering enemies by day and indulging in taverns or tents by night. Here's a quirky fact. When Sigurd reached Constantinople on his way home, the Byzantine Emperor Alexios V Komnenos welcomed him with grand ceremonies. Norwegians gawked at the riches of the city, its golden mosaics, silk-draped halls and endless entertainments. And according to rumour, Sigurd gawked at more than the mosaics. Whispers claim he indulged heavily in the city's famed pleasures. Banquets spilling with wine, women brought from across the empire, nights so extravagant that even Constantinople's cosmopolitan citizens raised their brows. Was it true? Maybe, maybe not. But for Norse sagas, the image of their king living like a Byzantine playboy was irresistible. Sigurd's appetite wasn't just foreign. Back in Norway, his reign was peppered with stories of nightly debauchery. Chroniclers complained that he surrounded himself with drinking companions, women of questionable virtue, and that his court resembled more a tavern than a throne. One monk grumbled that Sigurd treated the church's teachings as decorations for his crown, piously fighting in the Holy Land but laughing off the commandments once home. Imagine a Viking king in a candle-lit hall, roaring with laughter as he slammed his goblet down, while priests in the corner muttered prayers over the sound of drunken songs. The scholarly debate over Sigurd is thorny. Some historians argue he was genuinely devout, pointing out that he donated relics to churches, built monasteries and promoted Christianity across Norway. Others insist the rumours of his indulgences point to a man who used crusading as a stage to glorify himself, not Christ, a king more interested in the pleasures that came with power than in the faith he waved like a banner. Was he the model crusader or a hypocrite with a sword? The truth likely sways somewhere between, a man of conviction in battle, but weak to temptation when the torches burned low. Here's a fringe rumour that floated into legend. Some sagas claim Sigurd performed strange rituals in Jerusalem, mixing Christian rites with pagan Norse practices, especially when it came to fertility and women. One tale even suggests he sought out holy maidens as part of mystical unions, an echo of old Viking fertility rites carried into the Holy Land. Modern scholars dismiss this as myth-making, but the story stuck. Proof that even centuries later, people wanted to imagine Sigurd not only as a crusader, but as a man of dangerous, forbidden appetites. Picture yourself at one of Sigurd's homecoming feasts. The hall is vast, timber beams black with smoke, shields gleaming on the walls. Warriors bang their cups, mead spills across tables, and the king sits at the high seat, his beard glistening with foam, his arm around a woman draped in furs. He boasts of battles in the east, of treasures won, of holy victories, and then, in the same breath, demands another round of ale. The contradiction is stark. The crusader who prayed at Jerusalem by day and revelled like a pagan by night. And the irony? Sigurd's later life spiralled downward. His marriage collapsed, he grew increasingly unstable, and by the time he died in 1130, his once mighty reputation was already fraying. Civil wars erupted after his death, partly fueled by the many illegitimate children he fathered. His lusts weren't just private, they reshaped the kingdom's future, splintering the royal line into rival factions. In that sense, his indulgences proved as destructive as any battlefield defeat. So as you leave Sigurd's firelit hall, the smell of mead still stinging your nose, you realise the crusader's crown was gilded with both valour and vice. He fought for Christ, but he lived for pleasure. And as the echoes of drunken laughter fade, the next figure steps into the torchlight. Louis XI of France, the Spider King, whose perversions weren't about drunkenness or mistresses in the open, but about weaving secret webs of hidden romances and curious intrigues that made his court a labyrinth of lust and politics. You follow the trail back into France now, slipping into the cobwebbed corridors of Louis XI's court. He reigned from 1461 to 1483, earning the nickname the Spider King because of the invisible webs of intrigue he spun over France and Europe. And on the surface, Louis was all business. A shrewd, cold-eyed monarch who centralised power, crushed rivals, and laid the foundation for the modern French state. But underneath that carefully controlled exterior Rumours wound around him like the silk threads of his nickname, whispers of secret liaisons, hidden lovers, and curious intrigues that blurred the line between political conspiracy and bedroom scandal. Louis was nothing like the flamboyant Sigismund or the reckless Ladislaus. He dressed simply, avoided pomp, and often preferred to govern from small rural castles rather than glittering palaces. His austere habits, plain clothes, meagre meals, hours spent in prayer, made him seem more monk than monarch. But this very plainness invited gossip. If the king was so outwardly pious and plain, surely his sins must be hidden deeper, whispered the chroniclers. And thus began the legend of Louis's secret romances, carefully tucked away from the public eye, but woven into his web of power. One of the most persistent rumours concerned his use of female courtiers as spies. Louis relied heavily on informants, bribing and seducing people into feeding him secrets. Some claimed he extended this to noblewomen, turning intimate encounters into intelligence-gathering sessions. Picture it! The Spider King in a dim chamber, speaking softly with a duchess whose loyalty was secured not only by coin but by intimacies. Their whispered conversation equal parts pillow talk and espionage. To his enemies, this wasn't just politics, it was perversion, a corruption of both bed and crown. Here's a quirky fact. Louis adored mechanical contraptions and odd trinkets. He filled his private chambers with clocks, automata, and even cages for exotic birds. Chroniclers, always eager to connect dots, hinted that he extended this fascination with contraptions into his private life. Later rumours suggested he had curious devices made for his bedchamber, though whether that meant locks, cages, or something more salacious is anyone's guess. It sounds almost too modern, but when you think of Louis's obsession with control, the idea doesn't seem so far-fetched. Scholars debate fiercely whether Louis's private life was truly scandalous, or whether it was simply smeared by enemies who despised his spider-like politics. Some argue there's little hard evidence of perversion. He may have been dull and pragmatic, more obsessed with taxes than with mistresses. Others counter that his secrecy itself is suspicious. In an age when most kings paraded their mistresses openly, Louis's silence invited darker speculation. As one historian put it, Louis's sin was not indulgence but concealment. People filled that silence with whatever their imagination supplied. One fringe rumour even claimed Louis dabbled in occult practices tied to desire. He was known for his deep superstition, wearing charms, consulting astrologers, and praying obsessively to obscure saints. Some chroniclers stretched this into tales of him conducting strange rituals with women, blending lust and superstition in candle-lit rooms. Was it true? Almost certainly propaganda. But the image of the Spider King whispering spells over a lover's body stuck in the cultural imagination, too tantalizing to ignore. Imagine entering one of Louis's secret councils. The chamber is dim, the walls hung with maps and parchments. Louis sits hunched in a simple robe, his sharp eyes darting between advisors. At his side, a woman stands quietly, her presence unexplained but impossible to ignore. She leans close, whispers something in his ear, and he nods slowly. The advisors shift uneasily. Was that political advice or something more intimate? In a court where everything was webbed together, no one could tell where politics ended and perversion began. What's undeniable is that Louis XI's secrecy gave him a different kind of scandal. Where other kings flaunted their mistresses, Louis let rumour do the work. He never denied, never confirmed. Only let the webs tighten until his enemies tangled themselves in their own suspicions. Was he perverse? Perhaps. Was he brilliant at turning gossip into another tool of power? Absolutely. And so, as you step out of his small plain castle into the night air, you can feel the invisible strands brushing against your skin, sticky and unsettling. Louis's scandals may never have been as wild as Sigurd's or Alfonso's, but they linger in shadow, more suggestion than fact, more whisper than shout. And waiting ahead is a king who made no effort to hide anything. Christian II of Denmark, whose cruelty and twisted loves were so blatant that even his allies recoiled. Now your steps carry you north again, into the chill air of Denmark in the early 16th century, where Christian II reigned from 1513 to 1523. His name might sound tame, but don't let it fool you. Christian was notorious not just for political cruelty, but for the way he tangled love, lust and power into something that often looked more like sadism than romance. If Louis XI spun webs of secrecy, Christian II made his passions painfully public, and his cruelty seeped into both his politics and his private life until the two became indistinguishable. Christian married Isabella of Austria, sister of the powerful Emperor Charles V. On paper, it was a perfect dynastic match, tying Denmark to one of Europe's most powerful families. But Christian seemed far more interested in a Dutch commoner named Dyveke Sigbrittsdatter. Dyveke wasn't just a passing mistress, she was his true obsession. He flaunted her at court, gave her influence that horrified the nobility, and listened to her mother, Sigbrit, as though she were his minister. Imagine the scene, the young queen, a Habsburg princess raised in glittering palaces, sitting stiff at banquets while the king draped his affections openly on a merchant's daughter. Nobles sneered, ambassadors wrote furious letters, and the court dissolved into gossip. Here's a quirky detail. Dyveke supposedly had a taste for cherries, and chroniclers later claim she died from eating poisoned ones in 1517. Whether she was murdered by angry nobles or simply suffered food poisoning, her death was a turning point. Christian was devastated, and some whispered that his grief curdled into cruelty. He lashed out at nobles he suspected, executing one prominent man in a show trial. For his enemies, this was proof. The king's lust had turned to vengeance, and the court had become hostage to his twisted passions. Christian's cruelty wasn't limited to revenge. He developed a reputation for punishments that went beyond justice into humiliation. Some sources claim he enjoyed inventing degrading torments for those who displeased him, especially if they were tied to romantic rivalries or court gossip. His enemies painted him as a man who blended lust and violence, a monarch who treated his mistresses like queens but his rivals' wives and daughters like pawns in cruel games. Scholars debate whether this portrait is entirely fair. Christian's reign coincided with massive political turmoil, conflicts with Sweden, pressure from the Habsburgs, rebellion at home. His enemies had every reason to paint him as a monster. Yet the consistency of the stories, especially those involving Dyveke and his vindictive rage after her death, suggests at least a kernel of truth. Was he genuinely perverse, or just a king broken by grief and warped by politics? Historians are still arguing. Here's a fringe rumour that has not stuck. After Dyveke's death, Christian supposedly kept women at court who resembled her, dressing them in similar clothes and forcing them into roles that reminded him of his lost mistress. Whether true or not, the tale paints him as a man consumed by obsession, unable to let go, replaying desire like a cruel ritual. To his enemies, it was proof that lust had rotted his mind. Picture a night in Christian's court. The hall is dim, the queen sits in silence at the far end of the table, her Habsburg dignity holding like armour. Christian sits at the centre, laughing too loudly, a jewelled cup in one hand and his eyes fixed on a woman whose resemblance to Dyveke is unmistakable. Around him, courtiers whisper nervously, their glances darting toward the guards at the door. Everyone knows the king's favour can turn to fury in an instant. The air hums with both fear and scandal. And then there was the Stockholm bloodbath of 1520. Christian invaded Sweden, crowned himself king, and days later unleashed a massacre of nobles and clergy. Over 80 people were executed, their bodies left in the streets. To his critics, this wasn't just political cruelty. It was the same twisted streak that marked his private life, magnified onto the battlefield. They called him Christian the Tyrant. His love for Dyveke may have seemed soft at first, but his reign proved how easily passion and cruelty intertwined. By 1523, the people of Denmark had had enough. Rebellion forced Christian to flee, and he spent the rest of his life wandering in exile and captivity, dying in prison decades later. His downfall was political, but his legacy is soaked in scandal. The king who flaunted his mistress above a queen, who blurred lust with cruelty, who turned passion into tyranny. So as you leave his shadowed court, the sound of whispers still clinging to the walls, you feel the shift in tone. Some kings indulged in secret webs, some in drunken revels, but Christian Titu showed how easily desire could become cruelty when mixed with power. And ahead waits a group of monarchs in France, precursors to Henry III, whose extravagance and vice would dazzle and horrify in equal measure, showing how French courts could turn perversion into spectacle. Now the path curls back into France, just before the wars of religion, where kings in the late Valois line practiced a brand of extravagance that made chroniclers clutch their rosaries and nobles roll their eyes. If Christian of Denmark blended cruelty with lust, the French monarchs who came before Henry III transformed perversion into theatre. They weren't simply rulers who happened to have mistresses. They turned desire into pageantry, layering sandal onto silk and lace until the French court itself became the stage for rumours that Europe never stopped repeating. The most notorious of these precursors was Henry II, who reigned from 1547 to 1559. Though married to Catherine de' Medici, Henry openly adored his mistress, Diane de Poitiers, who was 20 years his senior. Instead of hiding the relationship, he flaunted it. Diane wasn't just a lover, she was effectively co-queen, dictating policy, managing the king's household, and appearing beside him in public. Picture the scandal. Catherine, the legitimate queen, forced to smile while her husband's mistress paraded in jewels Catherine herself couldn't wear. Nobles whispered, ambassadors gossiped, and yet Henry seemed utterly unbothered. For him, passion was politics, and Diane's presence was proof of his virility and his defiance of tradition. Here's a quirky detail. Henry II had the initials H and D for Henry and Diane entwined on emblems and architecture throughout France. In some cases, the entwined letters accidentally resembled the letter C as well, leading later commentators to joke that Catherine was unwillingly woven into the love knot. Imagine walking into a palace and seeing not your marriage but your husband's affair carved into the walls. That's not subtle. It's royal trolling centuries before memes. Henry wasn't alone in turning mistresses into near queens. His father, Francis I, was equally infamous. Francis embodied the Renaissance prince, handsome, cultured patron of the arts, and his appetites matched his reputation. He kept a stream of mistresses, often flaunting them as symbols of his masculine vigour. Chroniclers even accused him of contracting syphilis from one, which later earned him the mocking epithet the Great Poxed King. Francis's court became a whirl of pageantry where poetry, jousts and seduction blended seamlessly. One ambassador wrote that the king's bedchamber was as busy as his council chamber. And here's the debate. Were these kings truly perverse, or just more open than others? Some historians argue that French courts simply embraced a culture of display, where mistresses were part of the ritual of kingship, symbols of virility as much as personal indulgence. Others counter that the sheer scale of favouritism and influence these women wielded marked a deeper corruption, one that blurred the line between love and governance. Either way, the French set a model that Henry III would later amplify into something even more flamboyant. A fringe rumour that followed Francis I deserves mention. Some claimed he once staged an elaborate banquet where noble women dressed as mythological goddesses, serving food and drink to courtiers in a scene dripping with innuendo. Was it real or just gossip from outraged clerics? Hard to say, but the story reflects how contemporaries saw his reign, not just indulgent but theatrical, as though perversion itself had become a form of statecraft. Picture yourself in a French court banquet during this era. The hall glitters with Renaissance splendour. Tapestries of classical gods, silver cups overflowing with spiced wine, minstrels playing while nobles in silk exchange sly glances. At the high table, the king leans toward his mistress, whispering with a smile while the queen sits stone-faced beside them. The courtiers pretend not to notice, though everyone sees. The entire scene is one part feast, one part play, and one part scandal whispered into the night. What's striking is how normalised it all became. In France, the presence of mistresses wasn't a hidden shame but a public reality. Kings built palaces for them, granted them lands, even included them in state ceremonies. Critics fumed that lust had undermined the sanctity of monarchy, while admirers argued it proved the king's vitality. Either way, the spectacle prepared the stage for Henry III, whose court of mignons, beautiful young men dressed in silk, dripping with jewels, would scandalise Europe with open rumours of decadence. So as you step out of the glittering Renaissance halls of Francis and Henry II, the echoes of laughter and flirtation follow. These kings weren't the most perverse in history, but they were the trailblazers of public scandal, teaching Europe that French royalty would always blur the line between throne and bed. And up ahead, the next monarch, Charles VI, called the Mad, shows how when a king's mind unravels, his private life follows, birthing tales of perversion so wild that even centuries later, historians still debate whether they were madness, rumour or both. The path pulls you deeper into medieval France now, into the haunted reign of Charles VI, better known as Charles the Mad. He ruled from 1380 to 1422, a reign that stretched long but stumbled often, dominated by his unstable mind. Where Francis I and Henry II paraded mistresses like trophies, Charles gave his courtiers something more unsettling: a king whose mental breaks turned rumour into nightmare, and whose supposed perversions became tangled with his madness. For a kingdom already staggering under the weight of the 100 Years' War, having a monarch who thought he was made of glass or forgot his own name wasn't just inconvenient, it was terrifying. Charles's madness announced itself suddenly in 1392. Riding with his army through the forest, he suffered a violent breakdown, attacking his own men in a frenzy. From then on, his reign lurched between lucidity and chaos. Sometimes he governed with reason. Other times he refused to bathe, forgot he was king, or ran through the palace halls screaming. Chroniclers recorded that he occasionally refused to let people touch him, convinced his body would shatter like crystal. These episodes quickly fed into whispers about his private life. If the king's mind was so disordered, surely his desires must be as well. Here's a quirky fact. One of Charles's oddest habits was dressing in elaborate disguises. He adored costumes and masks which were already popular in France. But under his unstable hand, they veered into the bizarre. In 1393, he staged the infamous Bal des Ardents, the Ball of the Burning Men, where he and his companions dressed as wild men, covered in pitch and feathers, and danced by torchlight. Disaster struck when one of the dancers caught fire, and flames spread, killing several men. Charles barely survived. On paper, this was just a masquerade gone wrong, but gossip transformed it into something more sinister, a perverse spectacle of lust and madness, with the king prancing in near-naked costumes while women laughed from the galleries. Charles's relationship with Queen Isabeau of Bavaria also became fodder for scandal. During his lucid periods, he seemed affectionate. During his madness, he sometimes didn't recognise her at all. Isabeau stepped in as regent, wielding power alongside advisors, but her political enemies smeared her with accusations of adultery. The worst rumour claimed she slept with her own son, the Dauphin, a slander so grotesque it was clearly meant to ruin her, and by extension Charles. But since the king's mind was unstable, people whispered that maybe he allowed such things, or even participated in secret perversions. The line between political smear and genuine rumour blurred, until no one could tell where truth ended. Scholars still debate, was Charles truly perverted, or just mad, with enemies filling their apse? Some historians argue that his reign's scandals were almost entirely manufactured by factions vying for power, Armagnacs and Burgundians tossing slanders like weapons. Others suggest that while his illness made him vulnerable, some of the rumours of debauched masks and inappropriate liaisons may have roots in truth, especially given his penchant for theatrical excess. What's certain is that his madness made the French court a breeding ground for gossip that painted him as both unstable and immoral. Fringe rumour time. Some chroniclers claim Charles insisted on bathing with multiple women during lucid phases, claiming the water would restore his strength. Was this therapeutic quirk Renaissance medicine, or indulgence disguised as healing? Hard to know, but in an age when kings were symbols of morality, the idea of a glass king surrounded by women in bathwater was enough to spark endless tales of corruption. Picture yourself in Charles's palace during one of his better days. The halls are filled with music and masks, courtiers in strange costumes dancing under torchlight, but the joy is brittle, the laughter nervous. Everyone watches the king carefully, waiting for a slip into madness. At the high table, Charles whispers to his queen one moment, then suddenly leaps up, shouting at invisible enemies the next. Courtiers freeze, somewhere in the shadows, chroniclers scribble, already turning the chaos into scandal. Charles's reign left France shattered. His illness weakened the monarchy, deepened factional strife, and invited English advances in the 100 Years' War. But his reputation in memory wasn't just that of a mad king, it was of a monarch whose private life was painted as strange, grotesque, and perverse, whether true or not. Madness and perversion became intertwined, as though one proved the other. As you slip out of his court, leaving behind the flicker of torches and the faint smell of pitch from the Ball of the Burning Men, you can almost hear the whispered slanders echoing through the corridors. And up ahead, the next monarch waiting is Alfonso V of Aragon, a ruler celebrated as a patron of the arts, but whose passion for beauty extended into the bedchamber in ways that made his cultured image just as scandalous as his politics. Now the road curves south again into Aragon, where Alfonso V, nicknamed the Magnanimous, ruled in the first half of the 15th century. He wore the crown of Aragon, Naples and Sicily, and he loved to style himself not just as a king, but as a Renaissance prince, a generous patron of poets, artists, and scholars. His libraries brimmed with Greek manuscripts, his palaces glittered with frescoes, and his court echoed with debates about philosophy. But as with so many kings we've met tonight, his passion for beauty wasn't limited to paintings and poetry. Whispers spread that Alfonso collected lovers the same way he collected rare books, indulging in a long string of mistresses whose presence clashed with his carefully polished image as a cultured ruler. Alfonso was married to Maria of Castile, a pious and dutiful queen who lived most of her life apart from him. While Maria governed Aragon in his absence, Alfonso spent years in Italy, where his reputation blossomed into scandal. In Naples, he surrounded himself with artists, humanists and courtesans, and chroniclers claimed his palace became a strange blend of academy and brothel. Was it a court or a salon, a gallery or a harem? Depending on whom you asked, it was all of the above. Here's a quirky fact: Alfonso adored classical mythology and often staged plays and performances based on ancient themes. Rumours swirled that he extended these theatrics into his private chambers, dressing lovers as Venus or Diana, staging elaborate pageants of desire. Picture the scene: a candle-lit hall in Naples, women adorned with laurel crowns or draped in toga-like robes, while the king recited verses from Ovid. To Renaissance humanists, it might have looked like cultured homage. To bishops, it looked like pagan debauchery masquerading as art. One of Alfonso's most famous mistresses was Lucrezia Delano, a Neapolitan noblewoman whose relationship with the king lasted for decades. She wasn't a hidden scandal, she was openly adored, showered with gifts, lands and titles. So prominent was her role that when Alfonso's queen Maria remained childless, many whispered that Lucrezia was the true queen of his heart and possibly of his realm. For courtiers, this was awkward at best and humiliating at worst. Foreign ambassadors forced to treat a mistress with the respect due a sovereign. The scholarly debate here is lively. Some historians argue that Alfonso's love for Lucrezia was sincere, a lifelong partnership more romantic than perverse. Others note that his obsession with surrounding himself with women of beauty and intellect, often elevating them to positions of power, blurred the line between patronage and indulgence. Was he celebrating Renaissance ideals of love, or simply dressing up lust in poetry and philosophy? Modern scholars can't agree, but the tension between image and rumour makes Alfonso's private life as fascinating as his public one. A fringe rumour, whispered in Italy after his death, claimed that Alfonso dabbled in magical rites of Venus. According to these tales, he sought out alchemists and astrologers who promised him eternal vigour through secret rituals performed with his mistresses. Was this slander by his enemies, or evidence of his curiosity blending with superstition? Hard to say, but the image of the magnanimous king standing in a candlelit chamber surrounded by robed astrologers and half-draped courtesans perfectly captured the way people imagined him. Part scholar, part sensualist, part mystic. Picture a feast in Naples under Alfonso's reign. Scholars argue about Aristotle in one corner, poets recite verses in another, musicians strum lutes under frescoed ceilings. At the high table, Alfonso sits beside Lucrezia, their eyes locked in a private conversation, while nobles glance nervously toward the absent queen in Aragon. The hall glitters with art and intellect, but beneath it runs the current of scandal, the king's passions shaping politics as much as philosophy. Alfonso's legacy in Italy was complicated. He strengthened Naples, promoted humanism, and earned admiration as a cultured monarch. But the gossip never died. His love of beauty, whether in books, art or women, became inseparable from his reputation. To admirers, he was a Renaissance prince who embodied the harmony of love and intellect. To critics, he was a hypocrite who cloaked his perversions in the garb of learning. When Alfonso died in 1458, leaving no legitimate heirs, his carefully crafted legacy crumbled quickly. Lucrezia was pushed aside, his territories divided, and his scandals retold with relish by enemies. In the end, the magnanimous king was remembered not only for his libraries and palaces, but also for his endless pursuit of desire, a ruler who blurred the line between cultural patronage and private indulgence. As you leave the golden glow of Naples and step back into the night, the echoes of poetry and laughter trail behind you. Ahead waits a very different figure, Richard the Lionheart of England, the warrior king whose campaigns made him legendary so but whose private life remains a battlefield of questions, speculation, and scandal about where his true passions lay. The road pulls you back to England now, into the late 12th century, where Richard I, better known as Richard the Lionheart, reigns from 1189 to 1199. His name conjures images of battlefield glory, the thunder of hooves in the Crusades, banners snapping in the desert wind, the clash of swords against Saladin's armies. He was the model of a warrior king, fearless in combat, lion-hearted indeed. But when you step away from the battlefield and into the quieter chambers of his court, you find a man whose private life has fueled centuries of debate. Was Richard's heart really devoted to chivalry and Christendom? Or were his passions directed elsewhere, toward relationships that scandalise some and remain hotly contested by the scholars today? Richard's public reputation was almost paradoxical. He spent only a handful of months in England during his entire 10-year reign, preferring to fight abroad, yet he became immortalised as England's greatest night king. His charisma was undeniable, but his personal life was strangely opaque. He married Berengaria of Navarre, but their union was notoriously cold. Chroniclers noted that Berengaria barely saw her husband. Some even joked she never truly consummated her marriage. For a medieval king, whose first duty was to produce heirs, this was scandalous enough, but it opened the door to juicier speculation. If Richard wasn't interested in his wife, then where exactly did his passions lie? Here's a quirky fact. Richard was famously close to Philip II of France during his youth. The two kings formed an alliance, and some chroniclers wrote that they ate at the same table and shared the same bed. To modern ears, that phrase practically screams intimacy. But medieval chroniclers often used the language of brotherhood and fealty to describe political bonds. Was this poetic hyperbole or evidence of something more? Scholars debate endlessly. Some argue Richard and Philip shared a political bromance exaggerated by flowery chroniclers. Others see hints of a genuine romantic or sexual relationship that contemporaries didn't dare state outright. His enemies certainly seized on the rumours. Chroniclers hostile to Richard accused him of sins against nature, a coded phrase often used to suggest homosexual behaviour. Was this slander meant to undermine his moral authority as a crusader? Possibly, yet Richard himself seemed aware of the rumours. At one point he even publicly confessed to sins of lust, though he never specified what kind. For a man whose reputation rested on chivalric virtue, that confession only deepened the mystery. Picture Richard at a feast in Sicily before setting out on crusade. The hall is filled with knights boasting of battles, troubadours strumming out songs of chivalry. Richard sits at the centre, tall, broad-shouldered, his golden hair catching the firelight. At his side is not his queen, but Philip of France, their hands occasionally brushing as they lean in close. Around them, nobles exchange glances, see camaraderie, others see scandal. No one dares speak openly, but the whispers ripple through the hall. The scholarly debate today is sharp. Some historians insist Richard was likely homosexual or bisexual, citing his lack of interest in women and his passionate ties to men. Others caution that our modern categories can't be easily mapped onto medieval sources, where sharing a bed didn't always mean intimacy, and where confessions of lust could refer to anything from premarital flings to adultery. Still, the persistence of the rumours suggests that contemporaries found his private life unusual enough to merit comment, and unusual in a world where most kings' mistresses were paraded openly. Fringe rumours time, some later chroniclers claimed Richard kept a secret circle of young male companions during his crusade, treating them with the same indulgence that other kings reserved for mistresses. Was this a smear invented by church critics appalled at his failures in the Holy Land, or a garbled echo of truth? The sources are thin, but the imagery stuck, weaving itself into centuries of speculation about the Lionheart's true passions. And then there's the irony. For all his battlefield prowess, Richard left no legitimate heirs. His brother John, yes, the same John forever cursed in Robin Hood legends, succeeded him, a disaster for England. Was Richard's failure to produce heirs simply a result of dying young, or was it connected to his rumoured lack of interest in women? The question hangs in history like a torch flickering in a draughty hall, never fully answered, never fully extinguished. So as you step out of Richard's war-torn world, the clash of swords fading into the distance, you carry the image of a king who may have been as complex in love as he was in battle. His lion's heart roared in war, but in private it remained shrouded in whispers and questions. And the next monarch waiting in the shadows, Sigismund of Poland, offers something quite different. Not subtle whispers, but lavish court excess, drunken revels and salacious reports that turned his court into a theatre of scandal. Now your steps carry you east into Poland at the turn of the 16th century, where Sigismund I, known as Sigismund the Old, reigned from 1506 to 1548. His official legacy is polished, a Renaissance monarch, patron of art and architecture, a steady hand who strengthened the Jagiellonian dynasty. But when you scrape away the gilded portraits and church donations, you find a court buzzing with stories of indulgence, lavish excess, and salacious gossip that chroniclers gleefully recorded. If Richard the Lionheart left behind whispers, Sigismund left behind entire chapters of rumour, his court described as an almost theatrical stage where pleasure and politics performed side by side. Sigismund married twice. His first wife, Barbara Zápolya of Hungary, was pious and quiet, a match more practical than passionate. But after her death, Sigismund's love life took a turn that made gossip explode across Europe. He married Bona Sforza, a member of the infamous Italian Sforza family, a clan already notorious for poisonings, intrigues and rumours of lust. Bona was intelligent, ambitious and politically sharp, but her presence in Poland fed whispers that she brought Italian decadence into the royal court. And soon, stories of Sigismund's mistresses, lavish banquets, and questionable pastimes grew in the telling. Here's a quirky fact. Sigismund adored Italian culture. He imported architects, cooks, and musicians from Milan and Naples, filling his palaces with Renaissance flair. But enemies muttered that he imported more than art, that he filled the court with courtesans disguised as ladies-in-waiting, women who danced and laughed a little too freely at banquets. Whether true or not, the imagery of a Polish court drenched in Italian sensuality stuck fast, painting Sigismund as a monarch who let lust slip into politics. One persistent rumour involved his fondness for elaborate masks. Chroniclers wrote of nights when courtiers donned costumes, gods, goddesses, mythological beasts, and performed scenes dripping with innuendo. Sigismund, seated with Bona at his side, supposedly delighted in these risque performances, applauding the daring while bishops squirmed. Picture a candle-lit Krakow hall filled with nobles prancing in absurd disguises, half play, half flirtation, while the king laughed and clapped along. To Renaissance admirers it was culture, to critics it was corruption, and then there were the mistresses. While Bona wielded immense influence and bore Sigismund children, rumours swirled of his ongoing affairs. Chroniclers, ever eager for spice, named various noblewomen supposedly caught in his embrace. Was it truth or slander? Scholars disagree. Some argue that his reputation was inflated by rivals who wanted to undermine Bona by painting her husband as unfaithful. Others note that Sigismund's court records reveal an unusual number of generous gifts to certain women, suggesting at least some truth to the stories. A fringe rumour adds more intrigue. Some later writers claimed Sigismund indulged in fortune-telling and mystical rituals with his lovers, blending superstition and passion. Tales tell of him consulting Italian astrologers who promised to align the stars for his affairs, even holding ceremonies where women danced under planetary symbols. Whether factual or invented, the story reinforced the idea of a court where love and lust were cloaked in Renaissance mysticism. Imagine yourself in Sigismund's Wawel castle during a feast. The vaulted ceilings shimmer with candlelight, Italian music floats through the air, and platters of exotic foods, citrus fruits, spiced pastries, rare wines, spill across the tables. At the high seat, Sigismund lifts a jewelled cup, laughing as a costumed noblewoman dressed as Venus recites a bawdy verse. Bona watches with a smile too tight, courtiers whisper behind their sleeves, and bishops mutter prayers in the corners. It feels less like a kingdom's council, and more like a masquerade flirting with scandal. The scholarly debate about Sigismund is less about whether he indulged, he clearly did, and more about how far it shaped his reign. Some historians argue that his passions were trivial compared to his achievements. He stabilised Poland, modernised administration, and promoted the arts. Others insist that the endless gossip about mistresses and revels undermined his dignity, weakening his authority among nobles who saw his court as decadent. Which interpretation is true depends on how much weight you give to rumour in shaping real power. Sigismund died in 1548, remembered officially as a wise Renaissance king, but the memory of his court, lavish, theatrical, scandal-laden, lingered like perfume. His marriage to Bona, his supposed mistresses, his masks of gods and beasts, they became part of the tapestry of gossip that defined Europe's view of late medieval monarchs. And so here, as you step out of Wawel Castle, the laughter of masks still echoing faintly, you feel the journey nearing its close. One final hall remains, the wrap-up of the perverted pantheon, where all these kings, flamboyant, cruel, indulgent and bizarre, stand side by side, their scandals woven together into a strange lesson about power and desire. The journey has been long through smoky feasts, velvet-draped chambers, hunting camps turned into orgies, crusader tents filled with rumour, and courts that looked more like theatres of desire than seats of government. Now you stand at the threshold of this pantheon of perverted kings, looking back at the parade of monarchs whose appetites left as much of a legacy as their policies. Some drank themselves into oblivion, some flaunted mistresses like medals, some blurred the line between science and lust, and some let love curdle into cruelty. Together, they show how medieval monarchy wasn't just a story of laws and battles, but also of scandal, rumour and desire stitched into the fabric of history. Consider Charles the Bald, sneaking women into abbeys, or William Rufus, strutting in jewelled shoes with a court of beautiful boys. Philip IV sat in silence while gossip turned his household into a scandal machine, and Frederick II treated intimacy like an experiment in his endless curiosity. Alfonso XI practically set up a second throne for his mistress, Leonor, while Edward II's devotion to Piers Gaveston shook England its core. Valdemar II allegedly couldn't stop himself even while imprisoned, and Sigismund of Luxembourg turned hunting parties into stag night carnivals. James IV of Scotland rattled with chains of penance while parading mistresses. Wenceslaus IV staggered through the taverns with a bear in tow, and Erik Vakantond of Sweden let jealousy turn into murder. The line winds on. Edward IV and Francis II showed how passion could be paraded as politics. Ladislaus of Naples ruled more by seduction than law. John II of Aragon wove cruelty into intimacy, and Matthias Corvinus balanced brilliance with whispers of strange fetishes. Sigurd the Crusader fought for Christ by day and revelled like a Viking by night, while Louis XI spun invisible webs of rumour that painted him as a secret pervert. Christian VI turned obsession into tyranny after Divic's death, and the Valois kings before Henry III normalised mistresses as if they were policy advisors. Charles VI's madness blurred reality with perversion. Alfonso V disguised lust in the language of Renaissance poetry. Richard the Lionheart left behind centuries of speculation about his loves. And Sigismund of Poland cloaked Italianate excess in masquerades. Each of them reflected the strange truth of monarchy, that private life was never private. In a world where kings claimed divine authority, their lusts and perversions weren't just personal flaws, they were political crises, moral lessons, and sources of endless gossip. A king's mistress could destabilise dynasties. A king's favourite companion could spark rebellions. A king's cruelty in love could taint his image for centuries. Power magnified everything, turning whispers into history, until what we remember is less the laws they passed and more the scandals they couldn't escape. Here's the quirky takeaway. Medieval people genuinely believed the king's morality shaped the health of the realm. If he was lustful, crops failed. If he was cruel in bed, storms lashed the coasts. Kings themselves sometimes leaned into this belief, flaunting mistresses as proof of vigour, or, like James IV, wearing chains to balance desire with penance. The body of the king was not just his own, it was a symbol for the entire kingdom, which makes every affair, every obsession, every whispered fetish, not just gossip but politics. Scholars will forever debate how much of these tales were real and how much were crafted by enemies. Was Edward II truly in love with Gaveston, or was it just political favouritism magnified by rumour? Was Frederick II experimenting with lovers like a scientist, or was that the invention of churchmen who already hated him? Was Richard the Lionheart uninterested in women, or simply unlucky in heirs? The line between history and smear is blurred, but maybe that's the point. Kings were so elevated that the only way people could understand their flaws was through story and scandal. Imagine all of them gathered in one endless hall, candles flickering on stone walls. William Rufus toasts with jewelled shoes propped on the table. Frederick II scribbles notes while a concubine sighs. Edward II stares longingly at Gaveston while nobles scowl. Alfonso XI beams with Leonor at his side. and James IV rattles his chain as he reaches for another goblet. Across the room, Charles VI insists he's made of glass, while Sigismund of Luxembourg challenges a bear to drink more ale. It's absurd, chaotic, and a little terrifying, but it's also exactly how power looked when lust and politics tangled together. And as you step back from this pantheon of perverse monarchs, the lesson lingers. Power corrupts, desire exposes, and gossip preserves. These kings remind us that history isn't only written in treaties and battles, but also in sarums, ballads, and whispered rumours by firelight. Their perversions, real or imagined, are part of the strange, messy tapestry of the medieval world. The candles are burning low now, their wax dripping slowly, and the long procession of scandalous monarchs finally begins to fade into the quiet of night. You've walked through feasts soaked in wine, torchlit masks filled with innuendo, crusader tents heavy with rumour, and icy halls where cruelty and desire mixed into something far darker than love. You've seen kings parade mistresses as if they were crowns, others crumble into madness, and some use intimacy as one more weapon in their arsenal of power. And though centuries have passed, their stories cling like smoke, because people have always wanted to know not only how rulers fought wars, but how they lived and loved behind closed doors. It's tempting to laugh at some of it, the bear-walking Wenceslaus, the jewelled shoe strutting William Rufus, the endless banquets where costumed nobles pretended to be gods and beasts. There's humour in the absurdity, but there's also something sobering. These were real people with real power, and their indulgences often spilled into politics. A mistress could change alliances, an obsession could spark a feud, a cruel whim could topple a life. Desire was never just private, it rippled outward, reshaping kingdoms, sometimes breaking them. And maybe that's why these stories still matter. They remind us that power doesn't erase human weakness, it amplifies it. Kings weren't marble statues of virtue, they were messy, passionate, fragile humans whose flaws became public spectacle. Their scandals are history's way of reminding us that behind every crown is a person with hungers they can't always control. So now, as the laughter and whispers fade, you can let the hall of perverse kings slip away. The goblets are empty, the masks unmasked, the scandals tucked back into the pages of history, where they belong. All that's left is the soft hum of the night around you, the sound of your own breath, steady and calm, the kind of rhythm that pulls you gently towards sleep. Close your eyes. Picture those castles fading into mist, the echoes of feasts and battles dissolving, until there's nothing left but quiet. You've walked with kings, you've heard their secrets, and now it's time to let them rest, and to let yourself rest too. Sweet dreams.